The roots of the future Ottoman Empire are deeply intertwined with the vast plains and steppes of Central Asia, a region that for centuries was the cradle of nomadic peoples, warriors and herders who moved with their flocks of horses, sheep and camels. Among these peoples, the Oghuz Turks stood out, a collection of tribes that shared language, shamanic traditions, and a social structure based on the clan and loyalty to the tribal chief. This origin forged a militarized mentality in which survival depended on mobility, discipline, and the ability to fight as a group. The Oghuz would be fundamental to understanding the birth of various kingdoms and empires throughout the Middle Ages, including what would later become the Ottoman Empire. The region of Central Asia, marked by vast open spaces, deserts and mountains, never offered conditions for abundant agricultural settlement. For this reason, these peoples developed a culture focused on war and political alliances as a means of securing resources. Skill in horsemanship was a hallmark. Mounted archers were feared throughout the medieval world, capable of shooting arrows with precision while riding at high speed. This martial tradition spread throughout the Middle East and Europe, altering the balance of power on several occasions. In addition, the Turkic tribes gradually absorbed cultural and religious influences from the regions with which they came into contact. Zoroastrianism, Nestorian Christianity, Buddhism, and later Islam. It was precisely Islam that played the most transformative role for the Turks. Conversion began to gain strength from the 9th century, especially when tribal leaders realized that the Muslim religion offered not only a spiritual code, but also a form of political organization and integration with the powerful Islamic world, which extended from North Africa to Persia. The adoption of Islam allowed the Turks not only to legitimize their presence in Muslim lands, but also to participate in commercial networks, political alliances, and military campaigns as mercenaries or allies. The Islamic faith would thus become the ideological cement that united fragmented tribes into broader projects. Between the 10th and 11th centuries, large groups of Turks began migrating westward, driven by demographic pressures, internal conflicts, and the search for more fertile lands. This migration led them to Persia, the Caucasus, and finally Anatolia, a strategic region linking Asia to Europe. It was in this process that the role of the Seljuks emerged, an important branch of the Oghuz Turks. The Seljuks conquered vast territories and established the Sultanate of Rum, which would be responsible for securing a permanent Turkish presence in Anatolia. Their victory over the Byzantines at the famous Battle of Manzikert in 1071 opened the way for Turkish colonization of the region, radically transforming the ethnic and cultural landscape of Anatolia. This mass displacement was not only military, but also demographic. Entire villages, caravans and families crossed borders, bringing with them traditions, ways of life and social structures. Turkish presence began to reshape cities, fields, and even trade routes. Anatolia, once dominated by the Byzantine Empire and marked by an Orthodox Christian majority, became a mosaic of constantly changing cultures. Out of this cultural crucible, new political entities would be born, among them the small beylik founded by Osman V at the end of the 13th century, which would give rise to the Ottoman Empire. Therefore, to understand the foundations of the empire, it is essential to grasp this journey. From the steppes of Central Asia to the frontiers of Anatolia, through centuries of adaptations, wars, and alliances. The Ottomans would inherit not only the warrior spirit of the steppe horsemen, but also the capacity to absorb external influences, shaping an empire that would survive for more than 6 centuries. This beginning, marked by mobility and resilience, would be the secret of its historical endurance. The Battle of Manzikert, fought in 1071 between the Byzantine Empire and the Seljuk Turks, is considered a watershed moment in the history of the Middle East and Anatolia. Before this event, the region was firmly controlled by the Byzantines, heirs of the Eastern Roman Empire, whose capital, Constantinople, was one of the largest urban, economic, and religious centers of the medieval world. However, the advance of the Turkic tribes increasingly pressured the empire's borders. The Seljuks, led by Alp Arslan, had established themselves as a formidable force, controlling vast territories in Iran and Mesopotamia. The victory at Manzikert not only militarily weakened the Byzantines, but also paved the way for large-scale Turkish colonization of Anatolia, forever changing the political, ethnic, and religious configuration of the region. The Byzantine defeat was catastrophic because, in addition to human and material losses, it represented the collapse of imperial authority in eastern Anatolia. Byzantine troops, composed largely of foreign mercenaries, quickly dispersed after the battle, and the imperial nobility of Constantinople plunged into internal disputes that further eroded stability. This opened the way for Turkic tribes to penetrate deeply into the territory, settling in cities, towns, and rural areas. The resulting power vacuum would be filled by new Turkish states, known as beyliks, which would give rise to a new political order in the region. The Seljuk legacy was fundamental to this process. The Sultanate of Rum, established shortly after the victory at Manzikert, became a political and cultural center in Anatolia. Its capital, first in Nicaea and later in Konya, transformed into a hub of Islamic art, architecture, and knowledge. The Seljuks brought with them the highly sophisticated Persian administrative system, which allowed the integration of diverse populations under a relatively cohesive government. In addition, they encouraged the construction of mosques, madrasas, and caravanserais, strengthening both religion and commerce. This administrative and cultural model would be inherited by the Ottomans centuries later, shaping the character of the future empire. Political fragmentation also had lasting effects. With the fall of Byzantine authority and the Seljuks' inability to maintain absolute centralization, Anatolia became a mosaic of small Turkish kingdoms and principalities. These beyliks were simultaneously rivals and allies, disputing territories, trade routes, and influence over local populations. It was in this context of instability that the beylik of Osman, still modest and territorially limited, began to stand out. The political skill of its leaders, combined with the opportunity to expand over weakened Byzantine lands, allowed the Ottomans to consolidate themselves in a position of advantage. Another crucial element of the Seljuk legacy was the cultural blend that developed in Anatolia. As they settled in former Byzantine lands, the Turks came into contact with Orthodox Christian, Armenian, Greek, and even Latin populations. This coexistence, often marked by conflict, also generated forms of integration. The Turks incorporated words, agricultural techniques, and even architectural elements from local populations, creating a cultural synthesis that strengthened their identity. At the same time, Christian communities remained numerous, and this population diversity would require the future Ottoman rulers to possess remarkable skill in governing different religions and ethnicities under a single political system. Therefore, the Battle of Manzikert was not just a military victory. It symbolized the opening of a new era. The Turkish penetration of Anatolia, the rise of independent beyliks, and the flourishing of the Sultanate of Rum were the pillars upon which the Ottoman Empire would later be built. Without this initial fragmentation, and without the Seljuk cultural administrative legacy, the Ottomans would hardly have found the space and the instruments necessary to transform themselves into one of the greatest powers in world history. Osman I, also known as Osman Gazi, is recognized as the founder of the Ottoman dynasty and the figure who transformed a small frontier principality into a political entity destined to become a colossal empire. His birth, around 1258, coincided with a moment of deep instability in the Islamic world. The Seljuk Empire of Rum, which had dominated Anatolia after the victory at Manzikert, was weakened and disintegrating, pressured by Mongol attacks coming from the east and by internal fragmentation. At the same time, the Byzantine Empire, which still controlled significant parts of the region, was in decline, eroded by economic crises and dynastic disputes. It was in this power vacuum that Osman's small beylik emerged and began to expand. Osman belonged to an Oghuz Turkic tribe, part of the nomadic groups that had migrated to Anatolia in previous centuries. His father, Ertuğrul, had settled in the region of Söğüt, in a frontier zone between Byzantine territories and areas dominated by the Seljuks. This strategic location would be essential for the Ottoman future. The frontier, known as the Üç, was a land of constant war and cultural contact, where Turkic tribes, Christian and Muslim populations coexisted amid alliances, trade, and conflicts. Osman inherited not only the leadership of his tribe, but also the unique opportunity to expand his power by exploiting the weakness of his neighbors. The first decades of his leadership were marked by small military campaigns against Byzantine fortresses in the region. Using mobility tactics inherited from the steppe traditions, Osman managed to defeat better-equipped enemies through fast and devastating attacks. His military success brought him prestige and the loyalty of other Turkic groups who sought protection and opportunities for plunder and conquest. Gradually, his beylik ceased to be just a nomadic tribe and consolidated itself as a territorial political entity. Osman's prestige was reinforced by accounts describing him as a just leader, generous with his followers, and fervent in his Islamic faith, qualities that earned him respect and authority. An important element in building Osman's legitimacy was the use of religion as a political tool. At a time when war against the Christian Byzantines was seen as a form of jihad, or holy war, Osman and his followers presented themselves as defenders of the Muslim faith. This discourse attracted warriors known as Ghazis, frontier fighters dedicated to the struggle against infidels. The arrival of these warriors strengthened the Ottoman beylik militarily and expanded its support base, creating an aura of religious mission around Osman's leadership. This fusion of spiritual motivation and political ambition would become a hallmark of Ottoman expansion. Throughout his rule, Osman managed to conquer important Byzantine fortresses, including the city of Yenişehir, which came to be used as a base for new campaigns. His territorial expansion was not only military. As he conquered new regions, Osman implemented rudimentary administrative systems, collecting taxes and integrating local populations into his domain. This ability to transform military conquests into effective political control demonstrated a long-term vision, distinct from other tribal leaders who limited themselves to temporary raids. It was this ability that allowed the Ottoman beylik to establish solid foundations for its future rise. By around 1320, at the end of his life, Osman had consolidated a stable territory and established a dynasty that would be continued by his son, Orhan. Although he could not foresee the colossal destiny of his descendants, his legacy was the creation of a political, military, and spiritual structure that would serve as the foundation for an empire that would last 6 centuries. The name Ottomans, derived from Osman, perpetuates to this day his importance as the founding figure. From this point, the Ottoman rise would become inevitable, driven by the dynamism of his leadership and the fragility of neighboring states. With the death of Osman I around 1323, his son Orhan assumed leadership of the small Ottoman beylik. This moment represented a crucial transition. While Osman had been the founder and frontier warrior, Orhan would be responsible for transforming the beylik into a structured state with more stable political, military, and economic institutions. Under his leadership, the Ottomans conquered new cities and consolidated their presence in western Anatolia, expanding their power base and establishing the first administrative foundations of a future empire. The transition of power was relatively smooth, which already demonstrated the strength of the Ottoman dynasty compared to other Turkish beyliks, often marked by bloody disputes among heirs. One of Orhan's first and most significant conquests was the city of Bursa, taken in 1326. This victory was both symbolic and strategic. Bursa became the first Ottoman capital, offering the rulers a prosperous urban center with markets, workshops, and well-established trade routes. Unlike a temporary tribal base, the possession of a consolidated city represented a definitive step toward the centralization of power. Orhan used this conquest to initiate a process of urbanization that would become characteristic of Ottoman rule. He ordered the construction of mosques, bazaars, and administrative structures, integrating the city into his political authority and the Islamic identity of the state. The Ottoman army also underwent important transformations during this period. Orhan realized that to maintain lasting rule, he could not depend solely on tribal warriors or voluntary frontier fighters. Thus, he began structuring a permanent military corps, financed by taxes and organized into more disciplined units. This was the embryo of the military system that would later give rise to the famous Janissary Corps. Although rudimentary at the beginning, it already revealed an administrative vision oriented toward efficiency and continuity, something other beyliks in the region were unable to develop with the same intensity. Marriage alliances also played a strategic role in consolidating the dynasty. Orhan married the daughter of a Byzantine ruler from Nicomedia, establishing diplomatic ties that ensured him relative stability on the frontiers. These alliances, often overlooked in the more military-focused accounts of Ottoman expansion, show the diplomatic skill of their leaders, who did not limit themselves to force, but also used political strategies to strengthen their position. This balance between war and diplomacy would become a recurring feature of Ottoman expansion over the centuries. In addition, Orhan was responsible for creating institutions that strengthened the legitimacy of Ottoman power. Among them, the madrasas, or Islamic schools, stood out, which not only spread religious education, but also trained administrators and jurists. This allowed the Ottoman state to rely on a literate elite capable of organizing justice and fiscal administration. The creation of tax collection systems and the distribution of land to loyal warriors further reinforced internal cohesion, transforming the Ottomans into an increasingly structured force. During Orhan's rule, the Ottomans also crossed the Dardanelles Strait, setting foot in Europe for the first time. This advance into the Balkans, still modest, was a milestone in the expansionist trajectory that would eventually make the Ottomans rulers of vast European territories. The first campaigns in this territory showed that the Ottomans' geographical position, situated between Asia and Europe, gave them an incomparable strategic advantage, allowing control over essential trade and military routes. Thus, the first Ottoman conquests were not limited to territorial expansion, but represented the creation of a solid political, economic, and institutional foundation. Orhan consolidated the dynasty, transformed Bursa into a prosperous capital, established a permanent army, and laid the administrative and religious foundations that would sustain the empire's growth. Under his leadership, the Ottomans ceased to be just another beylik and began to stand out as a rising power, ready to dispute hegemony in the region. The conquest of Bursa in 1326 is often considered the first great milestone in the Ottoman rise. Until then, the beylik led by Orhan was little more than a regional semi-nomadic domain, whose strength came mainly from swift military campaigns and the loyalty of frontier warriors. However, with the capture of this city, the Ottomans came to control a consolidated urban center, capable of sustaining permanent administration and radiating cultural, economic, and political power. Bursa ceased to be merely a conquered territory and became the base from which the Ottomans would structure a lasting state. Bursa enjoyed a privileged strategic location. Situated on the slopes of Mount Uludağ, close to the Sea of Marmara and to the routes linking Anatolia to Thrace, the city offered both military and commercial advantages. Its fertile surroundings allowed for large-scale agricultural production, ensuring the supply of the population and the army. In addition, its position near maritime routes favored connections with Constantinople, then the Byzantine capital, and with important Mediterranean trade centers. For the Ottomans, who until then had lived in relative economic precariousness, this conquest represented a qualitative leap. They gained access to markets, workshops, and an urban infrastructure that would be fundamental for future expansion. The way Bursa was integrated into Ottoman rule reveals much about the style of government that would be consolidated in the following centuries. Instead of simply plundering and abandoning the city, as many tribal chiefs of the time did, Orhan and his successors chose to make it their capital and to invest in its urbanization. Monumental mosques, such as the Mosque of Orhan, and covered bazaars serving as centers of commerce and sociability were erected. Madrasas were also founded, which, besides teaching the principles of Islam, trained administrators and judges who would support the growth of the state. This move symbolized the transition from tribal leadership to an organized state authority, capable of governing diverse and complex populations. Another fundamental aspect was religious legitimization. Bursa came to be seen as a center of Islam in Anatolia. The construction of religious complexes known as kulliyas, which combined mosques, schools, hospitals, and public baths, demonstrated not only the devotion of the rulers, but also their concern with consolidating the city as a nucleus of Islamic identity. This model of urbanization, uniting spirituality, politics, and economy, would be repeated in other Ottoman cities over the centuries, culminating later in the grandeur of Istanbul. Bursa also played an essential role in the creation of an imperial bureaucracy. By centralizing administration in the city, the Ottomans began to organize tax collection systems, land registries, and the distribution of properties to loyal warriors. This last point was particularly important, By granting land to the fighters who had participated in the conquests, Orhan reinforced their loyalty and created a network of decentralized power still linked to central authority. This system, later known as Timar, would become one of the pillars of the empire's military and economic organization for centuries. The consolidation of Bursa as a capital also had cultural implications. The city became a meeting place for different traditions. Turks, Byzantines, Armenians, and Greeks coexisted under Ottoman administration, generating a cultural synthesis visible in architecture, art, and even daily life. This diversity was not only tolerated, but to some extent incorporated into the Ottoman model of governance, which was based on the idea of administering multi-ethnic and multi-religious populations without entirely destroying them. This characteristic flexibility would be one of the secrets of the empire's durability. Finally, Bursa became a symbol of the dynasty. It was there that the first sultans were buried, creating a sacred space of dynastic memory that reinforced the legitimacy of Osman's family. The fact that Bursa remained an important city even after the transfer of the capital to Edirne and later to Istanbul shows the depth of its historical importance. It was not only the first administrative capital, but also the cradle of Ottoman identity, the place where a tribal dynasty became a state, and where the foundations of an empire were laid. The conquest of Bursa had given the Ottomans their first capital, but it was not enough to consolidate themselves in Anatolia. The destiny of the dynasty was tied to something greater, the crossing into Europe and the domination of the Balkans. Orhan, succeeding Osman I, was the first to establish a solid base, and his son Murad I would continue this process, transforming the small beylik into a regional power of great significance. The entry into the Balkans did not happen immediately or simply. It was the result of political circumstances, Byzantine rivalries, and strategic opportunities that the Ottomans skillfully exploited. Orhan initially consolidated the frontier with the Byzantines. Although there were military confrontations, the Ottomans also benefited from the constant internal disputes of the Byzantine Empire, weakened by civil wars and economic crises. A decisive episode occurred when the Byzantine Emperor John Cantacuzenus requested military aid from Orhan to face his rivals in Constantinople. As part of this alliance, Orhan married the emperor's daughter, Theodora. This marriage, besides legitimizing the Ottoman presence as a political actor in the region, opened the doors to the official crossing into Europe. Thus, rather than a sudden invasion, the entry into the Balkans began through agreements and alliances. The decisive moment came in 1354, when a great earthquake destroyed part of the walls of the fortress of Gallipoli, located on the European coast of the Dardanelles Strait. Taking advantage of the natural disaster, the Ottoman troops occupied the fortress, turning it into their first permanent stronghold in Europe. This episode was seen by the Byzantines as an irreversible tragedy. The Turkish presence in Europe ceased to be temporary and became structural. From that point on, the Ottomans launched new campaigns, gradually expanding their influence over Balkan territories. With the death of Orhan, Murad I ascended the throne in 1362 and continued the expansionist policy. One of his first steps was transferring the capital from Bursa to Edirne, ancient Adrianople, a city located in Thrace, closer to the European frontiers. This change was not merely administrative, it represented a clear declaration of intent, as it showed that the Ottomans now saw Europe as the main stage of their expansion. Edirne quickly transformed into an administrative, military and cultural center, reinforcing Ottoman power in the Balkans. Murad I was also responsible for transforming the Ottoman army into a more organized and permanent force. It was during his reign that the devshirme system emerged, by which young Christian boys from the Balkans were recruited, converted to Islam, and trained to serve the state, giving rise to the elite Janissary Corps. This mechanism not only provided the Sultan with a loyal troop, free of tribal ties, but also created a highly efficient administration. The creation of this professional army was one of the factors that allowed the Ottomans to maintain a sequence of military victories against the Christian kingdoms of the region. Among the most important campaigns of Murad I were the Battle of the Maritsa River in 1371 and the Battle of Kosovo in 1389. At the Maritsa, the Ottomans defeated a coalition of Serbs and Bulgarians, securing control over most of Macedonia. At Kosovo, The Ottoman army faced a grand alliance of Serbs, Bosnians, Albanians, and other Christian peoples. Although Murad died in this battle, reportedly assassinated by a Serbian knight, the Ottoman victory definitively consolidated Turkish presence in the Balkans, marking the beginning of centuries of domination in the region. Therefore, the entry into the Balkans was not only the result of military strength, but also of political skill and the ability to take advantage of historical circumstances. Orhan paved the way with alliances and initial conquests, while Murad I structured the army and established the Ottoman presence irreversibly. From that moment, the empire ceased to be a local Anatolian power and became a transcontinental force, positioned between Asia and Europe, ready to challenge the greatest kingdoms of its time. The Ottoman advance in the Balkans during the 14th century marked the definitive transition from a regional beylik to an expanding imperial power. The consolidated presence in Edirne, the organization of a permanent army, and the adoption of the devshirme system created the conditions for military victories that would change the balance of power in southeastern Europe. Among the confrontations that symbolize this new era are the Battle of Kosovo in 1389 and the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396, two milestones that reinforced Ottoman supremacy and turned the Balkans into an integral part of their territory. The Battle of Kosovo, fought in 1389, was a clash between the Ottoman army of Murad I and a coalition of Serbs, Bosnians, Albanians, and other Christian allies, led by the Serbian prince Lazar Hrebeljanović. The field of Kosovo, a vast and strategic plain, became the stage for one of the most emblematic battles of medieval Balkan history. The Ottoman army, disciplined and reinforced by the Janissaries, faced a coalition seeking to halt the Turkish advance and preserve Christian autonomy in the region. The battle was bloody and evenly matched, but in the end, the Ottomans emerged victorious. One detail that marked this episode was the death of Sultan Murad I. Sources narrate that, during the battle, he was mortally wounded by a Serbian knight, possibly Miloš Obilić, who managed to infiltrate the Ottoman camp. Despite the Sultan's death, the Ottoman army maintained its cohesion and defeated the Serbs. This victory, even with the loss of its leader, consolidated the idea that the Ottomans had a divine mission, as the continuity of power was guaranteed by the immediate ascension of Bayezid I, Murad's son. The Battle of Kosovo would become, throughout history, a symbol for both Ottomans and Serbs. For the former, a spiritual and military triumph. For the latter, a founding tragedy that would mark centuries of resistance. A few years later, in 1396, came the Battle of Nicopolis, one of the greatest confrontations between the Ottomans and the medieval Western Christendom. The context was that of a crusade organized by Pope Boniface IX and supported by several European kingdoms, including Hungary, France, and even forces of the Holy Roman Empire. The goal was to stop the Ottoman advance and defend Christendom in the Balkans. The Crusader army, composed of French and Hungarian heavy cavalry, believed that their military superiority would guarantee victory. However, the arrogance of the Crusader leaders and their lack of discipline proved decisive for the disaster that followed. Bayezid I, known as the Thunderbolt for his speed in campaigns, demonstrated remarkable military strategy at Nicopolis. He used the tactic of positioning Turkish archers on hills, wearing down the heavy Crusader cavalry before launching his main forces, including the Janissaries, against them. The result was a crushing defeat for the Crusaders. Thousands of Christian knights were killed or captured, and many French and Hungarian nobles were taken prisoner. This victory not only consolidated Ottoman rule in the Balkans, but also sent a clear message to Western Europe. The Ottomans were not just a local problem, but a military power threatening all of Christendom. These two battles symbolize distinct but complementary moments of Ottoman rise. Kosovo represented the victory over the regional forces of the Balkans and the incorporation of Christian peoples into the Ottoman sphere, while Nicopolis demonstrated that not even the union of European powers could stop the Turkish advance. Together, they revealed the military skill, administrative discipline, and religious determination that characterized the emerging empire. From then on, the path to new conquests seemed inevitable, and the Christian world understood that it faced an adversary of imperial scale. With the death of Murad I at Kosovo in 1389, the Ottoman throne passed to his son Bayezid I, nicknamed Yildirim, which in Turkish means lightning. The epithet was no exaggeration. Bayezid was one of the most energetic, impetuous, and swift leaders of his age, conducting military campaigns with astonishing speed and expanding Ottoman domains in just over a decade of reign to a scale that far surpassed his predecessors. Yet his dazzling trajectory would end dramatically in a confrontation with Tamerlane, one of the greatest conquerors of Asia, in a battle that nearly destroyed the young empire. Immediately after taking power, Bayezid consolidated the victories his father had achieved in the Balkans. He swiftly defeated the Serbian forces and turned Serbia into a vassal state, demanding tribute and the supply of soldiers for his campaigns. He advanced against Bulgaria, incorporating it into Ottoman rule, and established a strong line of control along the Danube. He also subjugated Wallachia and pressured Hungary, making the Ottomans a constant threat to the Christian powers of Eastern Europe. His ability to quickly mobilize troops and conduct efficient sieges earned him a fearsome reputation among both allies and enemies. In Anatolia, Bayezid expanded aggressively as well. Taking advantage of the fragmentation caused by the decline of the Seljuks, he conquered several rival beyliks, annexing territories and incorporating their warriors into the Ottoman army. This partial unification of Anatolia under Ottoman control increased the resources available for new campaigns and strengthened the empire's economic base. At the same time, Bayezid consolidated the military system. The Janissary Corps was expanded, and new fortresses were built to secure the frontiers. His hunger for conquest seemed limitless, and his speed on campaign was compared to a lightning strike, hitting enemies before they had time to react. However, Bayezid's success also attracted the attention of a formidable adversary, Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane. Heir to Mongol and Turco-Mongol military traditions, Timur had built a gigantic empire stretching from India to Syria and from Persia to the steppes of Central Asia. Like Bayezid, he saw himself as an unbeatable conqueror, and their clash became inevitable. The rivalry began when Timur and Bayezid disputed influence over the Anatolian beyliks. Some princes, fearing Ottoman absorption, sought Timur's protection, which ignited the conflict. The decisive encounter came in 1402 at the Battle of Ankara. On one side, Bayezid led a large army composed of Janissaries, Anatolian cavalry, and Balkan contingents. On the other, Timur brought a colossal force, including veterans of his Indian campaigns and a corps of war elephants that caused astonishment and fear among the Ottomans. The battle was brutal and prolonged, but the outcome was disastrous for the Ottomans. Many Anatolian beyliks defected during the battle and joined Timur's forces, undermining Ottoman cohesion. Bayezid's army was crushed, and the Sultan himself was captured. Bayezid's fate after the battle became legendary. Sources recount that he was kept prisoner by Timur in humiliating conditions, though the accuracy of such reports is debated. What is certain is that he died shortly afterward, in 1403, still in captivity. The defeat at Ankara plunged the Ottoman Empire into a deep crisis. Without its leader, and with its territories fragmented, the Ottomans entered a period of chaos and internal disputes known as the Ottoman Interregnum. What seemed like the end of a rising power almost became reality, if not for the resilience of his successors. The trajectory of Bayezid I embodies the duality of Ottoman expansion. On one side, the overwhelming energy that allowed the rapid construction of an empire. On the other, the vulnerability that arose before equally powerful adversaries and the internal divisions that still marked the young dynasty. The lightning was brilliant and devastating, but his downfall showed that the road to imperial consolidation would be long, uncertain, and filled with trials. The defeat at Ankara in 1402 was not merely a military catastrophe, it triggered one of the greatest internal crises in Ottoman history. With Bayezid I dead in captivity and his territories fragmented, the empire plunged into a 13-year period of instability known as the Ottoman Interregnum. During this interval, between 1402 and 1413, the young dynasty was torn apart by succession disputes among Bayezid's sons, each supported by local factions, rival beyliks, and even foreign powers. This was the moment when the empire faced its greatest risk of disappearing, reduced once again to a confederation of small domains, and it only survived thanks to the political and military skill of one heir, Mehmed I. Immediately after Bayezid's capture, his sons, Suleiman, Isa, Musa, and Mehmed, clashed directly for leadership. The empire, already weakened by Timur's intervention, split into zones of power. Suleiman took control of Thrace and established his base in Edirne, maintaining diplomatic relations with the Byzantines to secure his position. Isa dominated part of Anatolia, but was soon defeated in internal confrontations. Musa relied on Balkan forces to contend for power, while Mehmed settled in the region of Amasya at the heart of Anatolia, gradually consolidating his army and authority. This division turned the empire into a chessboard of unstable alliances, with each brother trying to attract beyliks, janissaries, and even foreign mercenaries to his side. Neighboring powers, perceiving Ottoman weakness, seized the moment to regain territories and influence. The Byzantine Empire, which until then had lived under constant threat of annihilation, enjoyed brief relief. Emperor Manuel II Palaiologos forged alliances with Suleiman and, in exchange for support, obtained the return of some lands and fortresses. Balkan principalities such as Serbia and Wallachia also benefited, regaining autonomy or reducing their tribute payments. Even Venice and Genoa, interested in the trade routes of the Aegean and Black Seas, exploited the Ottoman chaos to secure advantages. Thus, the empire's central authority nearly disintegrated, threatening to make irreversible the collapse begun at Ankara. The turning point came with Mehmed, who proved the most skilled among the heirs. Unlike his brothers, who sought quick victories and fragile alliances, he consolidated his forces slowly, building a solid base of support among Anatolian warriors and loyal segments of the army. In 1410, Mehmed managed to defeat Musa, who had become a particularly aggressive rival in the Balkans. The victory was decisive because it allowed him to gradually restore the European territories and re-establish some stability. 3 years later, in 1413, Mehmed confronted Suleiman and emerged victorious, proclaiming himself the sole Ottoman ruler. The rise of Mehmed I marked the end of the interregnum and the beginning of a new phase of reconstruction. Known as the Restorer, he reorganized administrative structures, reaffirmed control over the janissaries, and reinstated the payment of tribute by vassal states. At the same time, he showed political pragmatism by negotiating with the Byzantines and other neighbors, avoiding large-scale conflicts while strengthening his internal power. This diplomatic posture gave the empire the chance to recover without immediately plunging into new, risky wars. The interregnum revealed the vulnerability of the nascent empire. A single devastating defeat and a succession dispute were enough to bring its survival into question. However, it also showed the resilience of the Ottoman dynasty. By emerging victorious, Mehmed I not only reunited the fragmented territories, but also established the tradition that the throne should be secured by the strongest heir, even if this meant fratricidal wars. This brutal practice, which would repeat itself in later centuries, sought to prevent the empire from again falling into prolonged divisions. Thus, from the chaos of the interregnum was born a hardened dynasty, aware that its survival depended as much on military strength as on political cunning. The victory of Mehmed I over his brothers in 1413 marked not only the end of the interregnum, but also the rebirth of Ottoman power. Known as the Restorer, he inherited a torn empire with uncertain borders, rebellious beyliks, insubmissive vassal states, and a weakened international reputation. His task was colossal: to reunite the dynasty, pacify regions that had taken advantage of the crisis to break free, and rebuild the institutions that would give solidity to central power. During his reign, between 1413 and 1421, Mehmed demonstrated a combination of diplomatic pragmatism and military firmness, restoring stability to the empire and preparing the ground for the resumption of expansion under his successors. One of Mehmed I's first measures was to reorganize central authority. To prevent new fragmentations, he reinforced the figure of the Sultan as the absolute axis of power, centralizing military, fiscal, and administrative decisions. To achieve this, he sought the support of the janissaries, offering them benefits and consolidating their loyalty. He also restored the system of military land grants, the timar, ensuring that warriors had incentives to remain loyal to the throne. At the same time, he firmly suppressed internal revolts, demonstrating that the state would no longer tolerate the autonomy of the beyliks that had grown stronger during the interregnum. In the field of diplomacy, Mehmed adopted a calculated stance. He knew that the empire did not yet have the strength for major wars of immediate conquest, so he preferred to negotiate with neighboring powers. The weakened Byzantine Empire became a temporary ally, with Manuel II Palaiologos maintaining good relations to avoid direct confrontations. The Balkan principalities, such as Serbia and Wallachia, were again forced to pay tribute, though without the brutality that could trigger large-scale rebellions. This flexible diplomacy allowed the empire to breathe and gather strength, rather than waste resources in premature campaigns. Another challenge faced by Mehmed I was the religious revolt of Sheikh Bedreddin's followers in 1416. Bedreddin was a jurist and mystic who defended egalitarian ideas and even proposed a kind of sharing of property between Muslims and Christians, which attracted discontented popular layers. His rebellion represented not only a military threat, but also an ideological challenge to the Sultanate. Mehmed repressed the revolt with violence, executing Bedreddin and his main followers. This episode reinforced central authority, but also showed how the empire had to deal with social and religious tensions in a multi-ethnic and diverse territory. On the administrative level, Mehmed I invested in the restoration of fiscal order. He created more organized collection mechanisms and fought local abuses, seeking to ensure that taxes reached the central treasury. He also encouraged the economic recovery of cities affected by war, stimulating trade and agriculture. Bursa, Edirne, and other strategic cities received special attention, functioning as poles of stability in the midst of an empire still under reconstruction. The Sultan understood that economic prosperity was essential to finance armies and public works, as well as to secure the loyalty of the population. Culturally, his government also sought to consolidate Ottoman identity. Mosques, madrasas, and religious foundations were built to reinforce the legitimacy of the Sultan as a Muslim leader. This policy of religious patronage was a way to unite diverse populations under Islam, while projecting the prestige of the dynasty. This spiritual aspect was not secondary. In an era marked by holy war against Christians and rivalry among Muslims, religious legitimation was one of the pillars of Ottoman power. When Mehmed I died in 1421, he left behind an empire once again unified, respected, and in a condition to expand. His son, Murad II, would inherit a more cohesive state, capable of facing new military challenges in the Balkans and Anatolia. Mehmed's merit, therefore, was not so much in conquering vast territories, but in ensuring that the dynasty survived the trauma of the interregnum and re-emerged stronger. His ability to balance diplomacy, military force, and administrative reform made him one of the most decisive rulers in the early history of the Ottoman state. With the death of Mehmed I in 1421, the Ottoman throne passed to his son Murad II, who inherited a restored empire still vulnerable to both external and internal pressures. Murad, barely over 18 years old, faced numerous challenges: revolts in Anatolia, offensives from Christian powers in the Balkans, and political conspiracies that tested his authority. His reign, lasting until 1451, was defined by relentless wars, especially against the Christian kingdoms of southeastern Europe, and by the consolidation of military and administrative practices that would ultimately enable the final victory over Constantinople, achieved only by his son Mehmed II. In his early years, Murad II confronted a crisis of legitimacy. In 1421, shortly after his ascension, the Byzantine Empire sought to exploit his youth by supporting a pretender to the throne known as Mustafa, who claimed to be a brother of Mehmed I. This so-called Düzmeçe Mustafa managed to attract support among certain Janissary factions and in parts of Anatolia, but Murad acted swiftly, defeating the rebellion and eliminating the usurper. The episode revealed that despite his youth, the Sultan possessed both firmness and political skill to defend his throne. Once the immediate threat was neutralized, Murad turned his attention to the Balkans, where Christian kingdoms sought to contain the Ottoman resurgence. Serbia, under the leadership of Stefan Lazarević, and later Đurađ Branković, Hungary under John Hunyadi, and states such as Wallachia and Albania became central players in a long sequence of confrontations. Murad led repeated campaigns against these foes, seizing strategic fortresses and imposing tributes. Serbia, in particular, became a constant battleground, wavering between resistance and submission. In 1444 came one of the most dramatic moments of Murad II's reign, the Crusade of Varna. Organized by Pope Eugene IV, this expedition brought together Polish, Hungarian and Wallachian forces who marched toward the Danube to try to drive the Ottomans out of Europe. Murad, who had briefly abdicated in favor of his son Mehmed II, returned to the throne in the face of the threat. At the Battle of Varna, the Ottomans confronted a large and determined Christian coalition. The young king of Poland and Hungary, Władysław III, led the Crusaders, but his boldness ended in disaster. He died in combat, and his army was crushed. The Ottoman victory at Varna consolidated their supremacy in the Balkans and reinforced Murad's reputation as an undefeated commander. Just a few years later, in 1448, Murad secured another decisive victory at the Second Battle of Kosovo. Once again, a vast coalition of Christian forces, led by John Hunyadi, tried to halt the Ottomans. The Kosovo plain, already the scene of Murad II's triumph decades earlier, once more became a symbol of both Christian resistance and Ottoman perseverance. The Ottoman victory reaffirmed their control over the Balkans and demonstrated that no organized resistance would be sufficient to halt their expansion. Beyond warfare, Murad II's reign was also defined by solid administration. He reinforced the devshirme system, expanding the recruitment of Christian youths to form an elite loyal to the Sultan. He also promoted public works, including mosques and urban complexes, particularly in Edirne, which remained the capital. Murad revealed a pragmatic vision. He combined military toughness with moments of diplomatic truce, recognizing that the empire's survival depended on a balance between war and peace. When he died in 1451, Murad II left his son Mehmed II an empire that was stable, with firm borders in both the Balkans and Anatolia, a disciplined army, and a relatively organized administration. His greatest contribution was preparing the ground for the monumental conquest of Constantinople. Accomplished just 2 years later, Murad stands as the stalwart defender of the nascent empire, the ruler who ensured the Ottomans survived formidable external threats and emerged as an undeniable power in southeastern Europe. The rise of Mehmed II to the Ottoman throne in 1451 marked the beginning of one of the most glorious phases in imperial history. Son of Murad II, he inherited not only a stable state, but also the historic mission of accomplishing what for centuries had been the dream and obsession of the Ottomans, the conquest of Constantinople, the imposing capital of the Byzantine Empire. This city, founded as Byzantium, transformed into Constantinople by Constantine, and for over 1,000 years the heart of Orthodox Christianity remained an almost insurmountable bastion between Ottoman Anatolia and the Balkans. Its control symbolized the Roman power of the East, and even in its decline, its mystical aura made it an irresistible goal. Mehmed II, known as Fatih, the Conqueror, ascended the throne at the age of 19 with uncommon determination. Unlike his predecessors who had besieged Constantinople but failed, he planned the campaign with patience and meticulousness. The first step was to strengthen the military apparatus. He reorganized the Janissary Corps, expanded the state's financial resources, and invested heavily in military technology. The greatest symbol of this preparation was the construction of gigantic cannons, cast by Hungarian master gunners, capable of hurling colossal projectiles against walls that had resisted all assaults for centuries. Another decisive step was controlling the surroundings of the city. Mehmed ordered the construction of the fortress of Rumeli Hisar on the banks of the Bosphorus Strait, ensuring that Constantinople was isolated and besieged both by land and by sea. This logistical blockade prevented large-scale Western reinforcements from reaching the city. Byzantine Emperor Constantine the Palaiologos sought help from Christian powers, but his plea met with lukewarm responses. Venice and Genoa sent small contingents, and some Crusader knights volunteered, but no large Western army came to the rescue. The siege began in April 1453. Constantinople, despite its grandeur, was weakened. The population had drastically decreased, resources were scarce, and the walls, though still imposing, faced the unprecedented challenge of gunpowder weapons. For nearly 2 months the city resisted heroically. The Theodosian walls, considered one of the greatest fortifications of the Middle Ages, were attacked day and night by Ottoman cannons. Mehmed's naval forces tried to break through the chains blocking the Golden Horn, and in a daring feat, the Ottomans transported their ships over land, using wooden logs as rollers to place them inside the harbour and fully encircle the city. The Byzantine resistance was led by Emperor Constantine XV himself, who became a symbol of courage and determination. Accounts narrate that he fought until the very end, refusing to abandon the city. But on May 29, 1453, the Ottomans launched their final assault. After hours of brutal combat, the Janissaries breached the walls, opening the way for the troops. Constantinople fell, and with it crumbled the last vestige of the Roman Empire. The Byzantine emperor died in battle, and his figure was enveloped in legends of sacrifice and heroism. The fall of Constantinople was an event of worldwide magnitude. For the Ottomans, it represented the consecration of their imperial destiny and the definitive victory over Byzantine power. Mehmed II transformed the city into the new capital of the empire, renamed as Istanbul. He encouraged its repopulation, bringing Muslims, Christians, and Jews to restore its economic and cultural vitality. Hagia Sophia, the magnificent Byzantine basilica, was converted into a mosque, symbolizing the transfer of power. On the international stage, the city's fall had a profound impact on Europe. For Christian kingdoms, it was a cultural and spiritual shock. The ancient capital of Eastern Christendom had succumbed to Islam. Many saw the episode as an apocalyptic sign, while others realized that the overland route to the east was closed, accelerating the search for new maritime routes, one of the factors that would drive the age of exploration. For the Islamic world, the victory reinforced Ottoman prestige, placing Mehmed II among the greatest conquerors in history. The conquest of Constantinople was not only a military episode, but also a change of era. It marked the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of a new period in which the Ottoman Empire asserted itself as the dominant power of the Eastern Mediterranean, a bridge between Asia and Europe, heir to both Roman and Islamic traditions. Mehmed II not only fulfilled a centuries-old dream, but also redefined the political and cultural map of the world. The conquest of Constantinople in 1453 was only the first step in a much deeper process, its transformation into an imperial capital. Mehmed II understood that it was not enough to seize the city by force. It was necessary to rebuild it as the political, economic, cultural, and spiritual center of the new empire. Ancient Constantinople, despite its legendary walls, was in decline. Its population had drastically diminished after centuries of wars, economic crises, and isolation. Mehmed's challenge was to reconstruct the city, revitalize it, and transform it into a metropolis that would embody Ottoman greatness. One of the first measures was to repopulate the city. Mehmed II promoted both forced and voluntary migration of different groups to Istanbul, including Anatolian Muslims, Greek Christians, Armenians, and Jewish communities from various parts of the empire. This diverse population gave the city a cosmopolitan character from the outset, making it a reflection of the multi-ethnic empire the Ottomans were building. By encouraging the settlement of merchants, artisans, and intellectuals, the Sultan restored the city's economic vitality and ensured it once again became one of the great urban centers of the world. In the religious field, Mehmed was pragmatic. He transformed the Hagia Sophia, the immense Byzantine cathedral, into a mosque, which symbolized the Islamic victory over Orthodox Christianity. However, instead of exterminating the Christian heritage, he incorporated it into the imperial system. The Orthodox Patriarchate was maintained and even strengthened under the Sultan's supervision, ensuring the loyalty of the Greek Orthodox population. Similarly, Jewish and Armenian communities were granted autonomy to manage their own religious affairs. This model of governance, based on the millet system, allowed each religious community to have leaders responsible to the state, reinforcing the stability of an empire marked by diversity. Administratively, Mehmed II established Istanbul as the seat of the imperial bureaucracy. Palaces, such as the Topkapi Palace, were built not only to house the Sultan's residence, but also the offices of the central administration. The imperial divan, the governing body that brought together viziers and councillors, began to operate in the new capital, centralizing political and military decisions. This reorganization consolidated the highly centralized character of the Ottoman state, in which the Sultan was the ultimate source of authority, but supported by an efficient bureaucracy composed of officials chosen for merit and loyalty. Economically, Istanbul quickly became the vital link between East and West. Located on the Bosphorus Strait, the city controlled the passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, dominating trade routes of grain, spices, and silk. Mehmed II encouraged the construction of bazaars, markets, and caravanserais, strengthening the city's role as a mercantile hub. The Grand Bazaar, initiated in this period, symbolizes this transformation. More than just a market, it was an economic nucleus integrating merchants from all over the world. Culturally, the new capital also flourished. Architects, poets, and scholars were brought to Istanbul, which became a center of intellectual and artistic production. The Ottoman architectural style, blending Islamic, Persian, and Byzantine elements, gained monumental expression with the construction of mosques, madrasas, and urban complexes. This process marked the beginning of the city's transformation into one of the greatest expressions of Islamic civilization. The transformation of Constantinople into Istanbul was, therefore, a conscious project of imperial construction. Mehmed II did not simply conquer a city, he reshaped it as the heart of a world empire, capable of rivaling Rome and projecting itself across 3 continents. This new capital symbolized Ottoman triumph, but also its ability to integrate diverse cultures, religions, and economies into a lasting political unity. After the transformation of Constantinople into Istanbul and its consolidation as the imperial capital, Mehmed II understood that the power of the empire could not be limited to land conquests. Control of the seas was essential to sustain Ottoman greatness, secure trade routes, and confront powerful rivals such as Venice and Genoa, who had dominated Mediterranean trade for centuries. It was in this context that the Ottomans began a systematic naval expansion, building fleets, maritime bases, and strategies that allowed them to contest control of the eastern Mediterranean and the Black Sea, consolidating themselves as a maritime power. The first stage of this naval rise was to secure control of the Black Sea. Since the 13th century, Italian cities, especially Genoa, had held commercial colonies in strategic points such as Caffa, Sinope, and Trebizond. Mehmed II launched decisive campaigns to eliminate this presence. In 1453, right after the fall of Constantinople, the Ottoman fleet blockaded the Genoese in the Bosporus. Shortly afterward, in 1461, the Ottomans conquered the Empire of Trebizond, the last Byzantine stronghold in the region, consolidating their dominance over the northern Anatolian coast. The result was the closure of the Black Sea to European ships, transforming it into an Ottoman lake for nearly 2 centuries. In the eastern Mediterranean, the challenge was more complex. Venice and Genoa possessed powerful navies and fortified bases on strategic islands and ports such as Rhodes, Crete, Cyprus, and the Dodecanese archipelago. To confront these rivals, Mehmed II and his successors heavily invested in naval construction. The imperial arsenal of Galata in Istanbul was expanded to become one of the largest shipyards in the world, capable of producing dozens of galleys and ships per year. This capacity allowed the Ottomans to compete for trade routes of spices, grain, and silk, previously monopolized by the Italians. The campaigns against Venice were particularly intense. In 1463, a war began that would last until 1479, marked by naval battles and sieges of coastal fortresses. The Ottomans captured fortresses in Greece, including Negroponte, Euboea, one of the main Venetian outposts. Despite Venetian resistance, the conflict ended with an Ottoman victory, consolidating their dominance over much of the Greek coast and firmly establishing their presence in the eastern Mediterranean. This war also demonstrated the growing efficiency of the Ottoman navy, which had become capable of rivaling the experienced Italian seamen. Beyond the wars against the maritime republics, the Ottomans also set their sights on the Christian military orders that still controlled strategic points. The Order of St. John, based in Rhodes, was a constant threat to Ottoman naval routes, attacking ships and disrupting trade. Although Rhodes resisted in the 15th century, the island was already a priority target and would later be conquered in the 16th century by Suleiman the Magnificent. These campaigns revealed the Ottoman strategic vision to control not only the coasts, but also the islands that served as naval bases. Ottoman maritime power had implications far beyond the military sphere. It reinforced the empire's economy by enabling control over trade routes linking east and west. Grain from Ukraine, spices from Asia, and artisanal goods from Anatolia and the Balkans circulated under Ottoman supervision. By monopolizing access to the Black Sea and imposing barriers in the eastern Mediterranean, the Ottomans forced European kingdoms to seek alternatives, one of the indirect causes of the Portuguese and Spanish age of exploration. Thus, Ottoman naval expansion not only strengthened the empire, but also profoundly altered the global economy. In summary, Ottoman maritime expansion after the conquest of Constantinople consolidated its role as a Mediterranean power. By transforming Istanbul into a naval hub, conquering strategic positions, and challenging Venice and Genoa, the Ottomans secured control over the eastern Mediterranean and the Black Sea. This maritime dominance extended the empire's reach, strengthened its economy, and projected its influence beyond land borders. The empire was no longer just a continental power. It became a force of the seas, capable of shaping the global balance of power. The 16th century marked the peak of the Ottoman Empire, and this apex is inextricably linked to the name of Süleyman Furs, known in the West as Suleiman the Magnificent, and in the Islamic world as Kanuni, the lawgiver. Born in 1494 and crowned Sultan in 1520, Suleiman ruled until 1566, in a reign that lasted nearly half a century. Under his leadership, the empire reached the largest territorial extent in its entire history, established itself as a first-rate naval and land power, and flourished culturally and legally. He was a ruler who managed to combine the image of conqueror with that of legislator, creating a balance between military glory and internal stability. On the military front, Suleiman took Ottoman expansionism to unprecedented levels. In Europe, his campaigns were primarily directed against the Habsburgs. In 1521, he conquered Belgrade, a strategic point that opened the way into the Central Balkans. 2 years later, in 1522, he won an even more emblematic victory. After a long siege, he expelled the Knights Hospitaller from Rhodes, securing Ottoman control over crucial maritime routes in the eastern Mediterranean. In 1526, at the famous Battle of Mohacs, he crushed the Hungarian army, which led to the collapse of the Kingdom of Hungary and allowed Ottoman expansion up to the frontier with Vienna. This offensive culminated in the Siege of Vienna in 1529, which, though unsuccessful, demonstrated the maximum reach of Ottoman power deep into the heart of Europe. In Asia and the Middle East, Suleiman also extended his dominion. He launched campaigns against the Safavid Empire, the Shiite rival in Persia, securing territories in Mesopotamia, including Baghdad, and consolidating Ottoman control over the commercial and religious routes of the region. In North Africa, alliances with corsairs such as Barbarossa allowed the empire to dominate Algeria, Tunisia, and parts of Libya, extending its influence to the very gates of the Atlantic. These victories, both on land and sea, ensured that the empire under Suleiman was at once a European, Asian, and African power. On the naval stage, the empire experienced its golden age. The Ottoman navy, led by admirals such as Hayreddin Barbarossa, became the dominant force in the Mediterranean. In 1538, at the Battle of Preveza, the Ottomans defeated the Christian coalition led by Venice and the Holy Roman Empire, ensuring maritime supremacy for decades. This naval power not only allowed control of strategic islands, but also safeguarded trade routes connecting the empire to the Indian Ocean, where the Ottomans vied with the Portuguese for influence. Under Suleiman, the Ottoman navy became a true projection of global power for the dynasty. Yet Suleiman's glory was not limited to military conquests. As Kanuni, the lawgiver, he undertook profound legal and administrative reforms. The Ottoman system of laws, which combined Sharia Islamic law with secular regulations, was codified and systematized. This gave greater predictability to justice, reduced arbitrariness, and consolidated state authority over subjects. Under his leadership, the empire achieved a level of administrative organization that made it possible to govern an immense territory populated by peoples of different religions and cultures. Ottoman culture also flourished impressively during this period. Istanbul became one of the brightest cultural centers in the world, hosting poets, architects, artists, and scholars. The architect Mimar Sinan, considered one of the greatest in history, built monumental mosques, such as the Süleymaniye Mosque, which became symbols of imperial splendor. Literature, music, and decorative arts reached unprecedented sophistication, reflecting the fusion of Islamic, Persian, and Byzantine traditions. Another notable aspect of Suleiman's reign was the role of the court and the harem in imperial politics. His consort, Hürrem Sultan, known in the West as Roxolana, wielded significant influence, marking the beginning of an era in which women of the palace would play decisive roles in Ottoman politics. This phenomenon, called the Sultanate of Women, would shape the course of the empire in the decades to follow. When Suleiman died in 1566 during a military campaign in Hungary, he left behind an empire at its absolute peak, vast, wealthy, militarily formidable, and culturally brilliant. However, its splendor also concealed future challenges. Governing such extensive territories would require an increasingly complex bureaucracy, and the costs of continuous warfare would begin to strain imperial finances. Still, his figure endures as the ultimate expression of Ottoman greatness, a sovereign who combined sword and law, conquest and culture, and who engraved his name in history as one of the greatest rulers of all time. The military and territorial splendor of the Ottoman Empire under Suleiman, the Magnificent, cannot be understood without looking inside the walls of the imperial palace. Behind the great campaigns, treaties, and conquests, there was a universe of intrigues, alliances, and silent disputes. The harem. Much more than a private space of pleasures, the Ottoman harem was a sophisticated political institution where strategic marriages, successions, and even directions of foreign policy were decided. The sultanas and other female figures who inhabited this world exercised real influence over the fate of the empire, shaping alliances and influencing the sultans at decisive moments. The harem of the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul housed hundreds of women, including official wives, concubines, daughters, sisters, and relatives of the sultan. But its structure was far from chaotic. It was governed by strict rules, hierarchy, and discipline. At the top of the hierarchy was the Valide Sultan, the sultan's mother, who possessed enormous political and administrative power. The Valide supervised the harem, controlled marriage alliances, and often exercised direct influence over government decisions. In many moments of Ottoman history, she was the true ruler in the shadows. Another central role was that of the favored consorts, among whom stood out figures like Hürrem Sultan, wife of Suleiman, known in the West as Roxolana. Of Slavic origin and brought as a slave, Hürrem rose to the position of favorite and later of legitimate wife, something rare in Ottoman tradition until then. Her rise marked a historical turning point. She not only influenced Suleiman in political decisions, but also actively engaged in diplomatic matters, maintaining correspondence with foreign monarchs and sponsoring public works. Hürrem symbolizes the beginning of the so-called Sultanate of Women, a period in which sultanas and valides exercised political power openly and decisively. The harem also functioned as a space for political formation. Ottoman princes, known as shehzadis, were educated in the palace environment until they were sent to govern provinces as part of their preparation. The mothers of these princes competed fiercely to ensure their sons inherited the throne, which turned the harem into a battlefield of silent struggles. Intrigues, poisonings, strategic marriages, and secret alliances were part of the dynamics that could decide who would become the next sultan. This struggle for succession sometimes resulted in tragedies, with the execution of rival princes to prevent civil wars. Besides the women, the harem was also linked to the figure of the eunuchs, especially the black chief eunuch, who managed the daily life of the palace and served as a link between the female world of the harem and the sultan. These men, deprived of descendants, were considered trustworthy to mediate information and manage secrets, which gave them enormous power. Often, eunuchs and sultanas formed strategic alliances, expanding their influence over the government. Palace politics, therefore, was not peripheral. It directly shaped the course of the empire. Decisions about peace treaties, wars, appointments of viziers and governors were often influenced by voices coming from the harem. This dynamic deconstructs the simplistic Western view that reduced the harem to a space of sensuality. In reality, it was a nucleus of political power, where the women of the dynasty played roles comparable to those of counselors, ministers, and even generals. The period known as the Sultanate of Women, which extended from the 16th century to the beginning of the 17th century, shows how the empire was not governed only by military power or the sword, but also by cunning, diplomacy, and palace politics. The influence of figures such as Hurrem Sultan, Qasim Sultan, and Turhan Sultan left deep marks, both on internal decisions and on the empire's image before the world. Thus, understanding the role of the harem and the sultanas is essential to grasp the complexity of Ottoman power, where the strength of armies was balanced by the silent intrigues of the corridors of Topkapi. If wars and conquests gave shape to the Ottoman Empire, it was its highly structured administration that guaranteed its longevity for more than 6 centuries. Unlike many medieval states that depended solely on the charisma of their rulers or the loyalty of tribal chiefs, the Ottomans created a bureaucratic and military machine of impressive efficiency, capable of integrating diverse populations, systematically collecting taxes, and maintaining a permanent elite army. Among the pillars of this administration were the Janissaries, the Devshirme system, and the complex network of governors known as pashas. The Janissaries formed the elite corps of the Ottoman army. Created as early as the 14th century, they were consolidated and expanded over the following centuries, especially under Murad II and Suleiman the Magnificent. They were highly trained, disciplined soldiers, directly loyal to the Sultan. Unlike the feudal troops of Europe, composed of nobles who provided knights in exchange for land, the Janissaries had no ties to local aristocracies. Their loyalty was absolute to the throne, which strengthened central power and limited the risk of noble rebellions. Armed initially with bows and later with muskets, they became one of the first permanent infantries of the modern age. The recruitment of Janissaries was directly linked to the Devshirme system, one of the most unique institutions of the empire. Periodically, Ottoman authorities selected young Christians from the Balkans, especially from peasant families. These boys were taken to Istanbul, converted to Islam, and subjected to rigorous physical, intellectual, and religious training. The most talented became Janissaries. Others were directed to the state bureaucracy or even to high prestige positions such as viziers and governors. The Devshirme system, although harsh and often seen as a form of oppression, also offered the possibility of social advancement. Many of the greatest Ottoman statesmen were of Christian origin, integrated into the elite through this process. In addition to the Janissaries, the Ottoman army also counted on the Timariot cavalry, composed of warriors who received land, called taimars, in exchange for military service. This system allowed the rapid mobilization of large contingents in times of war, while linking the military aristocracy to the prosperity of the state. Combined, Janissaries and cavalry created a hybrid army, both professional and feudal, adaptable to the empire's needs. At the top of the administrative hierarchy were the pashas, provincial governors responsible for enforcing the law, collecting taxes, and maintaining order in the provinces. Each pasha represented the sultan in his region and was closely supervised to avoid abuses or rebellions. This network of governors was essential to control an empire that stretched across 3 continents. To ensure the loyalty of these administrators, the sultan frequently rotated their positions, preventing them from creating independent power bases. The imperial divan, the central council presided over by the Grand Vizier, was the heart of the administration. There, military, diplomatic, and financial matters were discussed. The viziers, often trained through the Devshirme system, functioned as state ministers, and their competence was vital to keeping the imperial machine running. This administrative structure, combining centralization in Istanbul with controlled decentralization in the provinces, gave the empire both flexibility and cohesion. In parallel, justice was administered by a body of jurists known as qadis, responsible for applying Islamic law, sharia, and imperial regulations, kanun. This ensured legal uniformity throughout the empire, while at the same time respecting religious diversity through the millet system, in which Christian and Jewish communities maintained their own religious authorities to handle internal matters. This administrative mechanism allowed the Ottomans to maintain a balance between a strong central power and the diversity of peoples under their rule. The Janissaries ensured military strength, the Devshirme provided new talent and loyalty, and the pashas guaranteed governability in distant regions. It was this combination that transformed the Ottomans not only into conquerors, but into rulers capable of sustaining an empire that lasted centuries, resisting crises and rivaling the greatest powers of its age. The splendor of the Ottoman Empire was not sustained only by swords and disciplined armies. It depended on a solid economic base, capable of financing military campaigns, maintaining the imperial bureaucracy, and ensuring the loyalty of a vast and diverse population. From its earliest centuries, the Ottomans understood that their greatest advantage lay not only in military strength, but also in the strategic geographical position they occupied. The empire extended across regions linking east and west, controlling crucial trade passages such as the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits, in addition to land routes that connected the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, the Middle East, and even Central Asia. This location transformed the empire into a true hub of global economic intermediation. The spice trade was one of the pillars of the Ottoman economy. Since the Middle Ages, pepper, cinnamon, clove, nutmeg, and other oriental spices were highly valued commodities in Europe. These spices reached the Mediterranean through land and sea routes, controlled for the most part by the Ottomans. From Istanbul, Alexandria, and Syrian cities such as Damascus and Aleppo, caravans and ships transported goods from India and Southeast Asia. Ottoman dominance over these trade corridors allowed the imposition of tributes, customs duties, and tolls, which supplied the imperial treasury with constant wealth. It is no coincidence that Europe's search for alternative routes to the Indies, culminating in the Great Navigations, was largely motivated by the desire to escape the Ottoman monopoly over this trade. Another vital element was agricultural control. The empire encompassed fertile regions such as the valleys of Egypt, which provided abundant wheat, and the lands of the Balkans, which produced cereals, wine, and livestock. Anatolia, in turn, offered varied products ranging from silk and wool to dried fruits and nuts. The rural economy sustained the empire's food base and also supplied the armies in campaign. The Timar system, in which warriors received land in exchange for military service, ensured not only troop mobilization, but also the maintenance of agricultural productivity. In taxation, the Ottomans created a complex and efficient system. Direct taxes were collected in money or in kind, and there was also a wide range of specific levies: customs duties on goods, taxes on agricultural production, contributions from religious communities, and even special tributes for non-Muslims known as jizya. Although this last tax was a form of discrimination, it also worked as a mechanism of integration. By paying it, Christians and Jews could maintain their faith and autonomy within the millet system. This tax structure reinforced Islamic supremacy, but at the same time offered social stability. Since minorities knew what their obligations and rights were, the cities were the beating centers of the economy. Istanbul, with its immense bazaars, became an international marketplace where merchants from Venice, Genoa, India, Persia, and North Africa met. The Grand Bazaar and the Spice Bazaar symbolized this global integration. Edirne, Bursa, Damascus, Cairo, and Baghdad were also hubs of commerce and craftsmanship, each specializing in certain products: luxury textiles, ceramics, weapons, carpets, or perfumes. Artisanal production, often organized in guilds, guaranteed quality and standardization, strengthening the reputation of Ottoman products in the foreign market. The circulation of currency was another essential aspect. The empire minted its own gold, silver, and copper coins, which were accepted across vast regions. Monetary standardization facilitated both internal and external trade, while reinforcing the prestige of the state. The imperial treasury, known as the Inner Treasury, Hazine-i-Amir, accumulated resources from taxation, trade, and conquests, functioning as a reserve for military campaigns and major public works. This economic dynamism allowed the empire not only to sustain itself, but also to project power. The financing of permanent armies, the construction of monumental mosques, palaces, and urban infrastructure depended directly on the wealth generated by trade routes and the tax system. More than a warrior state, the Ottoman Empire was a global economic machine embedded in a network of exchanges that connected Europe, Africa, and Asia. In summary, the Ottoman economy was the invisible heart of its power. By controlling spice routes, imposing well-structured taxes, and managing abundant agriculture, the Ottomans transformed their geographical position into a financial and commercial empire. This economic strength was as relevant as the Janissary armies or the walls of Istanbul. Without it, the empire's grandeur would never have been sustained. The Ottoman Empire did not stand out only as a military machine or an economic power. It also left behind a profound and lasting cultural legacy, which united influences from the Islamic, Persian, Arab, Byzantine, and even European worlds. At the height of the empire, especially between the 15th and 17th centuries, Istanbul and other great Ottoman cities became vibrant centers of artistic, literary, architectural, and religious production. This multicultural fusion not only reflected the diversity of peoples under Ottoman rule, but also consolidated a unique identity, capable of continuously renewing itself and radiating its influence across 3 continents. Architecture was one of the most magnificent expressions of this culture. Inspired by the model of Hagia Sophia, transformed into a mosque after 1453, the Ottomans created a unique architectural style marked by monumental domes, slender minarets, and vast, well-lit interior spaces. The greatest exponent of this tradition was the architect Mimar Sinan, active in the 16th century, who designed some of the most impressive mosques in Islamic history, such as the Süleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul and the Selimiye Mosque in Edirne. These constructions were not only places of worship, they were urban complexes, kulliyes, that included schools, hospitals, public baths, and markets, integrating religious, social, and economic life. In poetry and literature, the Ottomans cultivated a sophisticated tradition, strongly influenced by Persian and Arab poetry. Ottoman Turkish, written in the Arabic script and enriched with Persian terms, became the literary language of the court. Poets such as Baki and Fuzuli created works of deep sensitivity, mixing themes of love, spirituality, and politics. The patronage of sultans and viziers ensured that literary production was abundant and recognized, reinforcing the idea that the empire was not only a military power, but also a guardian of Islamic culture. Music also flourished, with a refined tradition of Ottoman classical music that combined instruments such as the oud, the ney, and the kanun. This music, played in palaces and religious ceremonies, reflected both Sufi spirituality and the splendor of the court. At the same time, popular forms of music and dance, often linked to regional festivities, coexisted with this scholarly tradition, creating a plural cultural tapestry. The visual arts developed in different forms. Calligraphy, considered the highest of Islamic arts, was widely practiced and used to decorate mosques, palaces, and manuscripts. Illumination, with intricate designs and vibrant colors, adorned religious books and literary works. Ottoman tiles, especially produced in Iznik, became famous for their geometric and floral patterns in blue and red, adorning mosque and palace walls with unmistakable splendor. Religion was the guiding thread that united all these cultural aspects. Islam, especially in its Sunni form, was the spiritual and ideological foundation of the empire. However, the relationship between religion and Ottoman culture was marked by plurality and relative tolerance. The millet system allowed Orthodox, Catholic, Armenian, and Jewish communities to maintain their religious traditions, schools, and practices, as long as they recognized the authority of the Sultan and paid specific tributes. This coexistence contributed to the cultural richness of the empire, reflected in architecture, arts, and even gastronomy. Another central element was Sufism, a mystical movement within Islam that valued inner spirituality, music, and poetry as ways of drawing closer to God. Sufi orders, such as the Mevlevis, known as the whirling dervishes, had enormous influence on Ottoman cultural life, inspiring artistic practices and rituals that united faith and aesthetics. Thus, Ottoman culture was at the same time refined and popular, scholarly and plural, deeply rooted in Islamic tradition, but open to the influence of conquered peoples. Its legacy can still be seen today in Istanbul, in its tiles, mosques, poems, and music that have endured through the centuries. More than a warrior empire, the Ottomans were builders of a brilliant civilization, capable of transforming diversity into strength and art into a symbol of power. If in the West the Ottomans faced the Habsburgs and the late Crusades, in the East there was an equally formidable rival, the Safavid Empire of Persia. While the Ottomans were Sunni Orthodox, the Safavids adopted Shi'ism as their official religion, creating a deep division in the Islamic world. This religious opposition was combined with political and territorial rivalries, transforming the borders of Mesopotamia, the Caucasus, and eastern Anatolia into recurring battlefields. For centuries, the Ottoman-Safavid wars shaped not only regional politics, but also the religious configuration that persists in the Middle East to this day. The conflict began in the early 16th century, when Ismail I founded the Safavid dynasty and consolidated Shi'ism as the state doctrine. For the Ottomans, this rise represented a double threat: religious because it challenged the unity of Islam under Ottoman Sunni leadership, and political because the Safavids sought to expand their influence over disputed regions. The clash became inevitable in 1514 at the Battle of Chaldiran. Under the command of Selim I, the Ottomans defeated the Safavids with the use of heavy artillery and modern military tactics, while the Safavids still relied mainly on traditional cavalry. This victory allowed the Ottomans to temporarily occupy Tabriz, the Persian capital, and consolidate control over eastern Anatolia and Mesopotamia. However, Chaldiran did not end the rivalries. Throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, successive wars were fought between the two empires. Suleiman the Magnificent led campaigns against the Safavids, conquering Baghdad in 1534 and granting the Ottomans control over sacred cities such as Najaf and Karbala. Ottoman dominance over Mesopotamia was crucial not only politically but also spiritually, as it allowed the Sultan to claim the protection of the main Islamic pilgrimage sites. The wars continued under Suleiman's successors in a cycle of advances and retreats. The territory of the Caucasus, with regions such as Georgia and Azerbaijan, became one of the most disputed areas. Each peace treaty redrew borders, but the rivalry never disappeared. The Treaty of Zuhab in 1639 established a relatively stable border between the two empires, which, with minor variations, corresponds in part to the current division between Turkey, Iran, and Iraq. This line, born of centuries of war, still defines the geopolitics of the region. The rivalry between Ottomans and Safavids also had far-reaching cultural and religious effects. The strengthening of Shi'ism in Persia, in opposition to Ottoman Sunnism, deepened the split in the Islamic world. This division was not limited to theology. It influenced political alliances, trade, and even the identity of local populations. For the Ottomans, the Safavids were seen as dangerous heretics. For the Safavids, the Ottomans were usurping enemies. This ideological tension turned the eastern frontier into a symbolic barrier as much as a political one. Despite the violence of the wars, cultural contacts between the two empires never ceased. Merchants, artists, and scholars crossed the borders, carrying with them architectural styles, poetry, and decorative arts. Persian ceramics influenced Ottoman design, while Turkish calligraphy found admirers in Safavid territory. This paradoxical interaction of conflict and exchange enriched both cultures even amid hostilities. In summary, the conflicts with the Safavids reveal how the Ottoman Empire was not only a Mediterranean or European power, but also a central player in the Middle East. The dispute over Mesopotamia, the Caucasus, and religious supremacy in Islam defined much of its foreign policy and shaped borders that outlived the empire itself. More than battles, it was a rivalry that left deep marks on the identity of the East, dividing the Islamic world between Sunnis and Shiites in a lasting way. While consolidating their presence in the Balkans and confronting the Safavids in the East, the Ottomans also turned their attention to North Africa and the strategic routes of the Red Sea. This expansion not only broadened the empire's territories, but also strengthened its control over vital maritime passages that connected the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean and the global spice trade. The conquest of Egypt and the incorporation of Maghreb regions transformed the Ottomans into an Afro-Asian power with geopolitical reach that crossed continental boundaries. The decisive step occurred in 1517 during the reign of Selim I, known as the Grim. After defeating the Mamluks at the Battle of Ridania, the Ottomans seized Egypt, which had until then been governed by this military dynasty that ruled Cairo and controlled the holy sites of Mecca and Medina. With this victory, Selim not only annexed the fertile Nile Valley to the empire, but also assumed the role of protector of the Islamic holy cities. This conquest granted the Sultan unprecedented religious prestige, strengthening his image as leader of Islam. Control of Egypt had immediate economic consequences. The region was the breadbasket of the Arab world, producing huge quantities of wheat that supplied both the Middle East and the Mediterranean. Moreover, Cairo was one of the greatest commercial centers of the time, a crossroads for goods coming from the east through the Red Sea. By dominating Egypt, the Ottomans took control of these routes and imposed taxes on the spice trade bound for Europe. This strategic position reinforced the empire's centrality in the global economy and increased its capacity to compete with emerging maritime powers such as Portugal. In the Red Sea, the Ottomans had to face Portuguese expansion directly. Since the late 15th century, Portuguese navigators had rounded the Cape of Good Hope and established posts in the Indian Ocean, threatening the Muslim monopoly over eastern trade. To counter this threat, the Ottomans transformed the port of Suez into a naval base and built fleets that sailed the Red Sea, aiming to protect Mecca, Medina, and pilgrimage routes, as well as to preserve the commercial flows that sustained the empire. Although the Portuguese managed to remain in the Indian Ocean, Ottoman presence in the Red Sea ensured that the holy cities remained under Islamic protection and that the empire maintained influence over this vital region. In the Maghreb, expansion was marked by both military campaigns and alliances with local corsairs. Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli, which had been under increasing Spanish pressure after the Reconquista, sought Ottoman support. Admirals such as Hayreddin Barbarossa placed their fleets at the service of the Sultan, transforming the Western Mediterranean into a stage of direct confrontations between Ottomans and Spaniards. The incorporation of the Maghreb brought strategic benefits. Besides enlarging imperial territory, it allowed the projection of power against Europe from the African coast. This presence in North Africa also carried religious and ideological significance. The Ottomans presented themselves as defenders of Islam against the Christian threat, reinforcing their role as caliphate and protectors of the faith. This image strengthened internal cohesion within the empire and justified military campaigns in the Mediterranean and the desert. Thus, the expansion into Egypt, the Red Sea, and the Maghreb consolidated the transcontinental character of the Ottoman Empire. From that moment, the Ottomans were not only a European and Asian power, but also an African one. By controlling the Nile Valley, the holy cities of Islam, the Red Sea routes, and the North African coasts, they extended their reach and became a key player in the global balance of the 16th century. This expansion secured resources, religious legitimacy, and international projection, transforming the empire into one of the greatest powers of its age. The 16th century was marked by the rise of the Ottoman Empire as a maritime power, but also by one of the greatest naval battles in history, the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. This clash symbolized both the peak of Ottoman presence in the Mediterranean and the limits of its expansion in the face of organized European resistance. The sea, which until then had increasingly seemed like a domain under Ottoman control, became the stage of a continental-scale struggle involving Christians and Muslims in a fight that would define the course of naval balance in the region. The Ottoman navy had reached impressive strength since the time of Suleiman the Magnificent. Led by admirals such as Barbarossa and Piale Pasha, the Ottomans controlled most of the eastern Mediterranean and projected their influence as far as the Maghreb. Ottoman fleets raided Christian coastal cities, protected trade routes, and directly confronted Venetian and Spanish armadas. Control of strategic islands such as Rhodes, Cyprus, and Crete was essential to securing maritime supremacy. Cyprus, in particular, became the spark of the Battle of Lepanto. In 1570, the Ottomans invaded the island, then under Venetian rule, and after a brutal siege, they captured Famagusta, strengthening their presence in the Mediterranean. The conquest of Cyprus deeply alarmed Christian Europe. In response, Pope Pius V succeeded in forming the so-called Holy League, an alliance between the papacy, Venice, Philip II's Spain, the Knights of Malta, and several other Italian powers. This coalition assembled a fleet of more than 200 galleys, commanded by Don John of Austria, half-brother of Philip II. On the Ottoman side, the fleet commanded by Ali Pasha gathered similar numbers, totaling more than 250 ships. The encounter of the two forces took place in the Gulf of Patras, near the city of Lepanto in Greece. On October 7, 1571, the two largest fleets of the time clashed in a colossal battle. The combat was brutal, with ships colliding, soldiers fighting hand to hand, and the sea stained with blood. Although the Ottomans had a larger number of ships, the organization of the Holy League and the use of onboard artillery gave them the advantage. After hours of struggle, the Ottoman fleet was crushed. About 200 ships were destroyed or captured, and more than 30,000 Muslim fighters were killed, including Ali Pasha. It was one of the most devastating defeats in Ottoman naval history. Despite the magnitude of the defeat, the Battle of Lepanto did not represent the collapse of Ottoman maritime power. In less than 2 years, the shipyards of Istanbul had already rebuilt almost the entire fleet that was lost, demonstrating the empire's impressive capacity for recovery. Even so, the battle had lasting symbolic and strategic consequences. For Christian Europe, Lepanto was celebrated as the first great victory against the Ottomans at sea, a sign that Islamic expansion could be contained. For the Ottomans, although naval supremacy in the eastern Mediterranean was maintained, the battle revealed that hegemony was not absolute, and that the balance of power depended on constant vigilance and investment. In the long term, Lepanto also accelerated changes in naval strategies. The increasing use of cannons on larger ships began to transform warfare at sea, moving away from the traditional model of oar-driven galleys. The Ottomans, who relied heavily on this type of vessel, would need to adapt to new technologies that would soon give advantage to Atlantic powers such as Spain, Portugal, and later England and the Netherlands. Thus, the Battle of Lepanto was both a crushing defeat and a turning point. The Ottoman Empire showed resilience by recovering quickly, but its aura of naval invincibility was broken. From then on, the Mediterranean became a space of unstable balance, in which Ottomans, Venetians, and Spaniards disputed every island and every route, without any side being able to establish total dominance. Lepanto did not end the Ottoman maritime era, but it marked its limits in the face of the combined strength of European Christendom. Between the 16th and 17th centuries, one of the most intense rivalries in European history arose between the Ottoman Empire and the House of Habsburg. On one side, the Ottomans, at the height of their military and territorial strength, sought to expand their influence into the heart of Europe. On the other, the Habsburgs, ruling vast domains that included Spain, Austria, and parts of Central Europe, saw Ottoman expansion as an existential threat. This dispute materialized in countless conflicts, but was most symbolically represented by the sieges of Vienna in 1529 and 1683, when the Ottomans stood at the gates of Central Europe, poised to alter the political and religious destiny of the continent. The first siege of Vienna took place in 1529, just 3 years after the Ottoman victory over Hungary at the Battle of Mohacs. That battle had been disastrous for the Hungarians. King Louis II died in combat, and the kingdom collapsed. Taking advantage of the power vacuum, the Ottomans annexed much of Hungary and turned it into an imperial province. Emperor Charles V and his brother Ferdinand of Habsburg tried to respond, but Suleiman the Magnificent advanced quickly as far as Vienna. The siege, however, failed due to torrential rains, logistical problems, and the city's stubborn resistance. Despite the withdrawal, the episode made clear how close the Ottoman threat was to the European heartland. In the following decades, Hungary became the main battlefield between the Ottomans and the Habsburgs. While the Ottomans controlled central Hungary, the Habsburgs held Vienna and regions of Austria, creating an unstable and militarized frontier. Wars, skirmishes, and yearly campaigns followed, wearing down both sides. For the Ottomans, expanding into Europe was a way of legitimizing their power before the Islamic world. For the Habsburgs, resisting was a matter of survival. The second great siege of Vienna occurred in 1683, more than 150 years after the first. By then, the Ottoman Empire was still powerful, but already showing signs of strain. Under the command of Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, an army of more than 150,000 men surrounded Vienna, defended by far fewer forces. The city resisted for 2 dramatic months until a Christian coalition organized by the Pope and led by the Polish king John III, Sobieski, launched a decisive counterattack. The Battle of Kahlenberg, in September 1683, resulted in a crushing victory for the Christians and marked the end of the Great Ottoman Offensive in Central Europe. The consequences of this second siege were profound. The defeat at Vienna triggered the so-called Great Turkish War, 1683-1699, a series of campaigns in which the Habsburgs, along with Venice, Poland, and Russia, pushed the Ottomans out of Hungary and the Balkans. The Treaty of Karlowitz, signed in 1699, sealed these losses and marked the beginning of the Ottoman retreat from Europe. If in the 16th century the Ottomans had represented the greatest threat to Christian Europe, by the end of the 17th century they were already beginning to be seen as an empire in decline. However, the rivalry with the Habsburgs was not merely military, it also had religious and symbolic dimensions. For the Ottomans, besieging Vienna was more than conquering a city. It was challenging Catholic European power and asserting their supremacy in the Islamic world. For the Habsburgs, resisting meant preserving Western Christendom. This struggle, which lasted for nearly 2 centuries, shaped the political and cultural identity of Central Europe, leaving scars and memories that endured for generations. Thus, the sieges of Vienna represent both the height and the limit of Ottoman expansion in Europe. They symbolize the clash between 2 global empires, whose ambitions collided in the continent's heart. Although the Ottomans failed to capture Vienna, their permanent presence in the Balkans and Hungary left deep marks on European history, consolidating a rivalry that defined the geopolitics of the era. After the peak achieved under Suleiman the Magnificent and his immediate successors, the Ottoman Empire began to show signs of exhaustion. Although it was still one of the greatest powers in the world, its vast territory, its complex administration, and the internal and external pressures created a slow yet continuous path of decline. This process did not occur abruptly, but extended over centuries, marked by administrative corruption, military crises, social revolts, and economic difficulties that gradually eroded the empire's vitality. One of the first signs of weakening came from the very military structure. The Janissaries, who for centuries had been the disciplined elite corps loyal to the Sultan, began to transform into a conservative force resistant to change. Once dedicated to training and war, they became involved in commercial activities, marriages, and private businesses, losing the exclusivity that had made them special. More seriously, they became a powerful political group, capable of deposing or enthroning sultans, turning into an obstacle for reforms. Rebellions by the Janissaries became frequent, generating instability in the capital and undermining central authority. Administrative corruption also weakened the efficiency of the state. The Taimar system, which granted land to warriors in exchange for military service, collapsed as sultans began distributing lands to court favorites and high officials without requiring military obligations. This practice reduced the availability of troops and weakened the link between land ownership and military duty. At the same time, the sale of administrative and judicial positions became common, creating an elite more interested in personal enrichment than in serving the empire. On the economic front, difficulties accumulated. Ottoman control over spice routes was gradually weakened by the Age of Exploration, which opened new maritime routes to Asia, allowing Europeans to bypass Ottoman monopolies. Furthermore, the arrival of precious metals from the Americas into Europe triggered inflation that destabilized imperial finances. The empire, accustomed to collecting fixed-value taxes, saw its currency devalue and its revenues lose purchasing power. This economic shock undermined the fiscal base and increased pressure on peasants and merchants. Internal revolts were another constant factor. Subjugated peoples, such as Serbs, Greeks, Bulgarians, and Albanians, frequently rebelled against Ottoman rule, fueled by religious rivalries and economic exploitation. Even within the Muslim world, uprisings arose, such as the revolts of dervishes and messianic movements that challenged the Sultan's authority. In rural Anatolia, armed bands of discontented peasants known as Kilali emerged, plundering villages and defying local authorities. These internal uprisings corroded stability and forced the empire to spend precious resources on repression. On the international stage, pressure from European powers intensified. Rivalry with the Habsburgs and repeated conflicts against Russia constantly tested Ottoman military limits. Each defeat resulted in disadvantageous treaties and territorial losses, especially in Hungary and the Balkans. Naval supremacy, already shaken at Lepanto, was increasingly threatened by the rise of Atlantic navies, which came to dominate global trade routes and diminish the Mediterranean's relevance. This decline did not mean the empire was on the verge of immediate collapse. On the contrary, its vast extension and strong social base still gave it remarkable resilience. However, The combination of corruption, military crisis, internal revolts, and changes in the global economic system made it clear that the empire no longer possessed the same creative energy that had carried it to its peak. The title of the sick man of Europe, attributed centuries later, has its roots in this process that began after the splendor of the 16th century. In summary, the gradual decline of the Ottoman Empire was not a single episode, but a long erosion. The institutions that had once sustained its rise became obstacles, the discipline that had shaped its armies gave way to disorder, and the wealth that had fueled its greatness was drained by the new global economy. The empire would survive for a long time yet, but the brilliance of Suleiman would never be fully recovered. The Janissaries, once the pillar of Ottoman military power, perhaps represent the most emblematic example of how an institution created to strengthen the empire ended up becoming one of its greatest problems. Originally conceived as an elite corps, disciplined, trained from childhood, and entirely devoted to the Sultan, the Janissaries were born from the Devshirme system, in which Christian children were recruited, converted to Islam, and educated to serve in the army and administration. For centuries, this force maintained cohesion, loyalty, and efficiency, ensuring remarkable victories and consolidating the Ottomans' image as an unmatched military power. However, the rigidity and discipline that once defined the corps were gradually eroded over time. Starting in the 16th century, when the sultans began allowing the Janissaries to marry and engage in business, the exclusivity of their function was compromised. Many opened workshops engaged in trade and accumulated personal fortunes, undermining their military dedication. Instead of living solely as soldiers in the service of the state, they transformed into an influential social group with interests independent of the empire's needs. The political power of the Janissaries grew at the same pace as their discipline declined. In Istanbul, they became a force capable of exerting direct pressure on the Sultan and the central government. Barracks rebellions became frequent, and on several occasions the Janissaries deposed rulers, imposed salary increases, or intervened in the appointment of high officials. The elite force, instead of serving as an instrument of imperial power, turned into an autonomous and feared political actor, placing its own interests above those of the state. On the military front, the Janissaries' resistance to reforms was devastating. While European armies adopted new techniques, infantry tactics, and more advanced firearms, the Janissaries opposed any changes that threatened their privileges. Reforms proposed by reformist sultans such as Selim III met with violent resistance and often ended in bloody uprisings that paralyzed the government. This systematic opposition prevented the Ottoman armed forces from modernizing at the same pace as European powers, placing the empire at a disadvantage in decisive wars. Moreover, their presence in Ottoman cities constantly generated instability. In Istanbul, they were feared by both the population and the rulers. When dissatisfied with salaries or benefits, they looted markets, burned entire neighborhoods, and threatened government structures. This instability undermined confidence in central authority and created an environment in which the Sultan's power was constantly challenged. The collapse of discipline and their transformation into a parasitic force slowly eroded the Janissaries' original function. From guardians of order, they became agents of disorder. From elite soldiers, they became a conservative group resistant to progress. Their power was only truly broken in 1826, when Sultan Mahmud II organized the so-called Auspicious Incident, a violent crackdown that resulted in the destruction of the corps and the execution of thousands of its members. But until that moment, the weight of the Janissaries had delayed Ottoman military modernization for centuries, directly contributing to the empire's decline. Thus, the Janissaries symbolize how vital institutions can deteriorate and turn into destructive forces when their interests outweigh the common good. The corps created to serve the Sultan ironically ended up limiting and weakening imperial power. In the 18th century, one of the greatest external pressures the Ottoman Empire faced came from Russia, which was beginning to assert itself as an expanding power. Unlike the Western powers, which sought the Mediterranean and the Middle East through maritime and colonial trade, the Russians turned their attention southward, aiming for access to the Black Sea and later the Mediterranean. This strategic goal was vital, as the Russian Empire, with its harsh climate and northern ports often frozen, desperately needed permanent maritime outlets to consolidate its presence as a European power. Since Peter the Great in the early 18th century, Russia had transformed into a modern military force, reformed along Western lines. The contrast between Russian dynamism and Ottoman rigidity was already evident. While the Russian army went through modernization processes, the Ottomans remained dependent on an outdated military system, hindered by the limitations imposed by the Janissaries and the lack of a centralized modernization strategy. A clash between the two empires was inevitable. The first major wars between the Ottomans and the Russians occurred as early as the 17th century, but it was in the 18th century that conflicts intensified. The central point of contention was control of the regions around the Black Sea, such as Crimea, vital for its strategic location and for being inhabited by Muslim Tatars allied with the Ottomans. The gradual loss of this territory meant not only a strategic setback, but also a symbolic defeat, as it represented the retreat of Islam in the face of the expansion of an Orthodox Christian power. The most decisive conflict took place during the reign of Catherine the Great in Russia. Between 1768 and 1774, the Russo-Turkish War was fought, culminating in the Treaty of Küçük-Kaynarca. This treaty was a milestone in Ottoman decline, as it represented a humiliating defeat at the hands of a power that until then had been seen as secondary compared to Western monarchies. By the agreement, the Ottoman Empire recognized the independence of Crimea, which was soon annexed by Russia. Furthermore, it granted the Russians the right to protect Orthodox Christians living under Ottoman rule, creating a justification for future Russian interventions in the empire's internal affairs. The treaty also guaranteed Russia the right of free navigation through the Black Sea and direct access to the Mediterranean via the Straits, a severe blow to Ottoman sovereignty. This conquest not only consolidated Russia as a southern naval power, but also paved the way for it to continue pressuring Ottoman borders in the following decades. For Istanbul, this meant a constant threat, as Russia had secured a strategic position that further weakened Ottoman authority over its European and Balkan territories. The series of defeats against Russia exposed the backwardness of Ottoman military forces compared to emerging powers. While Russian generals and officers applied modern tactics, the Ottomans clung to outdated methods, and a command system often corroded by corruption and lack of coordination. This disparity became evident not only on the battlefield, but also in diplomatic negotiations, where the Russian Empire began to dictate terms that placed the Ottoman Empire in a submissive position. Thus, the 18th century marked a geopolitical turning point. Whereas the Ottomans had previously represented a threat to Christian powers in Europe, from this moment on, they came to be seen as a declining empire, vulnerable to external pressures. Russia, in particular, assumed the role of the most constant and dangerous enemy, taking advantage of the empire's weaknesses to expand its borders and its political, religious, and military influence in the region. The struggle for control of the Black Sea and for the protection of Orthodox populations in the Balkans became, from this point on, one of the central axes of international politics in the 18th and 19th centuries, setting the stage for new conflicts that would further undermine the stability of the Ottoman Empire. In the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire perhaps faced its greatest enemy not on the battlefield against foreign powers, but within its own borders, the awakening of nationalism. For centuries, the Ottomans had ruled over a vast diversity of peoples in the Balkans, each with its own language, religion, and traditions. The millet administrative system allowed for a certain degree of religious autonomy, but over time, social tensions, economic inequalities, and the inspiration from European revolutionary movements awakened a growing desire for independence among these populations. The Balkans were a cauldron of identities. Serbs, Greeks, Bulgarians, Albanians, and Romanians coexisted under Ottoman rule, but each of these groups developed a sense of national belonging that grew stronger as Enlightenment ideas and liberal revolutions spread across Europe. The most direct example came from the French Revolution, and later from the independence of neighboring countries such as Greece. These events served as beacons, showing that it was possible to break free from imperial rule and build autonomous nation-states. Dissatisfaction was also fueled by economic and social factors. Many of these peoples suffered from high taxes and discrimination compared to the Muslim population of the empire. Furthermore, the internal reforms known as the Tanzimat implemented from the mid-19th century, although aimed at modernizing the state, ended up generating resistance. For Christian populations, they were not enough to resolve inequality. For more conservative Muslims, these reforms seemed like a dangerous concession to Western pressures. Thus, the empire was torn between those who demanded greater modernization and those who defended the preservation of traditions. The first major spark came with the Serbian Revolution in the early 19th century. With indirect support from Russia, the Serbs rose up against Ottoman rule and, after decades of struggle, achieved growing autonomy. Serbia's success inspired other peoples, especially the Greeks, who waged a brutal war of independence between 1821 and 1830. The Greek conflict attracted Europe's attention, and powers such as England, France, and Russia intervened militarily in favor of the insurgents, leading to the creation of an independent Greek state. For the Ottomans, the loss of Greece was a devastating symbolic blow, for that territory represented not only strategic wealth, but also immense cultural heritage. The advance of nationalism in the Balkans did not stop there. From the second half of the 19th century, Bulgarians, Romanians, and Albanians began organizing political and cultural movements in favor of independence. The empire responded with violent repression, but each uprising only drew more international attention and generated greater internal exhaustion. The massacre of Bulgarians in 1876, for example, was widely denounced in Europe, serving as a pretext for further foreign interventions. Internally, the rise of nationalism eroded the empire's cohesion. Each victory of the separatist movements weakened the prestige of the Ottoman Porte and encouraged new rebellions. Moreover, the link between religious identity and nationalism was a powerful weapon against imperial rule. Orthodox Christians saw in Russian support a natural ally, while Catholics found backing from Western powers. The Ottomans, increasingly isolated, found themselves in a political labyrinth with no easy way out. Thus, the Balkans became the Achilles heel of the empire. What was once one of its richest and most productive regions turned into a constant stage of revolts, wars, and instability. Nationalism, fueled by European ideologies and reinforced by the empire's own weaknesses, unleashed an irreversible process of fragmentation that slowly eroded the foundations of Ottoman power. This phenomenon not only reduced Ottoman territory, but also undermined its legitimacy as an imperial power. After all, if it could not hold together the European heart of its possessions, how could it withstand the external pressures coming from all sides? Balkan nationalism was, in essence, one of the greatest proofs that the empire no longer had the means to survive without deep changes it could never implement in time. In the 19th century, while the Ottoman Empire was weakening internally with the advance of nationalism in the Balkans, a new threat became increasingly evident: Russian expansion toward the south. Since earlier times, the Tsars had dreamed of conquering Constantinople and controlling the straits of the Bosporus and the Dardanelles, as this would guarantee them direct access to the Mediterranean and greater influence over global trade routes. For the Ottoman Empire, this Russian ambition represented an existential threat, and the clash of interests would eventually lead to the Crimean War, one of the most defining conflicts of the century. The spark of the war came from a religious issue, though it concealed much broader interests. The dispute over the protection of Orthodox and Catholic Christians living in Ottoman territories led to diplomatic clashes between Russia and France. Tsar Nicholas I demanded that the Sultan recognize Russia as the official protector of Orthodox Christians, which would grant the empire enormous influence over Ottoman internal affairs. The Sultan refused, backed by France and England, who saw Russian expansion as a threat to the European balance of power. Thus, an apparently religious question turned into an international conflict. In 1853, Russian armies invaded the Danubian principalities, and soon the war spread to Crimea, a strategic peninsula in the Black Sea. The Ottoman Empire on its own would not have been able to face the military might of Russia. However, European geopolitics created an unexpected situation. England and France decided to intervene in defense of the Ottomans, not out of altruism, but to prevent Russia from becoming strong enough to destabilize the international system. This was one of the rare occasions when Western powers fought side by side with the Ottomans, establishing an alliance that surprised many contemporaries. The Crimean War was marked by bloody battles and brutal conditions. The siege of Sevastopol, a city fortified by the Russians, became the central episode of the conflict. For months, Ottoman, British, and French troops fought against the Russian defenders in combat that combined trenches, heavy artillery, and devastating diseases. More soldiers died from typhus, cholera, and poor sanitary conditions than in actual combat. The war also entered European memory with the episode of the Charge of the Light Brigade, a disastrous British cavalry attack that ended in massacre, but became a symbol of both bravery and military folly. One of the most innovative aspects of the Crimean War was its journalistic coverage. For the first time, war reporters sent accounts almost in real time to European newspapers, allowing the public to follow events. Photographer Roger Fenton captured images of the conflict, and the letters of nurse Florence Nightingale, who worked in field hospitals, revealed the deplorable conditions in which soldiers were treated. Nightingale's work, in fact, was a milestone in the history of nursing, bringing profound changes to military medical care. In the end, the war resulted in a victory for the Ottoman Western Alliance. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1856, forced Russia to renounce its claims over the Orthodox Christians of the empire and prohibited the militarization of the Black Sea. For the Ottoman Empire, the treaty offered a temporary relief and reinforced its position as an integral part of the European political system. However, this victory was fragile, as it depended on foreign support. The impact of the Crimean War was profound. On one hand, it showed that the empire was still relevant enough to attract the protection of European powers. On the other, it exposed the Ottoman dependence on external aid and highlighted the internal weaknesses of its army and administration. Furthermore, it inaugurated a period in which Ottoman affairs would no longer be merely internal matters, but would constantly be debated on the international stage, a phase that became known as the Eastern Question. In summary, the Crimean War represented a temporary diplomatic and military victory for the Ottomans, but it made clear the uncomfortable reality. The empire would only survive as long as it was useful to the European powers in the geopolitical balance game. After the Crimean War, the Ottoman Empire faced a crucial dilemma: remain anchored in administrative and social structures inherited from the Middle Ages, or launch into a process of reforms to try to keep pace with European modernization. This need for change gave rise to the period known as Tanzimat, a Turkish word that literally means reorganization. Between 1839 and 1876, the empire experienced a cycle of legal, administrative, social, and military transformations, with the goal of strengthening the state and preventing collapse in the face of internal and external pressures. The starting point of the Tanzimat was the Edict of Gülhane, proclaimed in 1839 by Sultan Abdülmecid I. Inspired by Enlightenment ideals and European legal codes, the edict declared principles of equality for all subjects before the law, guarantees of security for life and property, and tax reforms aimed at greater fiscal justice. For the first time in an official document, Muslims and non-Muslims were placed on the same legal footing, in an attempt to reduce tensions among religious communities and weaken the influence of foreign powers that used the protection of minorities as a pretext to intervene in Ottoman affairs. In the administrative sphere, the Tanzimat sought to rationalize the functioning of the state. New ministries were created, provinces were reorganized, and local administrative councils were introduced. The aim was to reduce the power of regional governors and centralize control in the hands of the government in Constantinople. The military recruitment system was also reformed, replacing arbitrary practices with more uniform methods, which allowed the empire to assemble more organized armies, although they still fell short of the efficiency of European powers. The legal field was one of the most impacted by the reforms. Inspired by the Napoleonic Code and other European models, the Ottomans created new secular courts that operated alongside traditional religious courts. These institutions introduced more modern norms of civil and commercial law, which were fundamental for attracting foreign investment and modernizing trade. Furthermore, the Hayat-i Humayun of 1856, another important decree, reinforced equality among all subjects of the empire, explicitly prohibiting religious-based discrimination. In education, the Tanzimat represented a silent revolution. Secular schools were founded to train bureaucrats and military personnel according to modern standards. The teaching of foreign languages, mathematics, and sciences expanded, and universities were planned to train a new administrative elite. This educational policy had a profound impact on the formation of intellectuals and politicians who, in the following decades, would become the main protagonists of nationalist and reformist movements. However, the Tanzimat was not merely a modernization process, it also revealed contradictions. While it proclaimed equality, in reality many communities were still treated unequally, and the privileges of the Muslim elite resisted change. Moreover, the reforms required enormous financial resources, forcing the empire to contract loans with European banks, which resulted in growing indebtedness. Another delicate aspect was social reaction. Many conservative sectors saw the Tanzimat as a threat to Islamic traditions and the established social order. For them, adopting European codes and reducing the role of Sharia in the courts was a sign of moral decline. For non-Muslim groups, however, the promises of equality often rang hollow in the face of persistent prejudices and discriminatory practices. Despite its limitations and contradictions, the Tanzimat marked a turning point. For the first time, the Ottoman Empire consciously placed itself on the path of Western modernity, attempting to reform internally before being completely pressured from outside. This period did not save the empire from its eventual fate, but without it, later political and social transformations would have been unthinkable. The Tanzimat opened the door for the emergence of new political actors, such as the young Ottomans, who would demand constitutions and greater popular participation in political life. Thus, the Tanzimat was an ambitious and complex effort. It sought to modernize without destroying, to reform without completely breaking with the past, and to balance Islamic tradition with European influences. This balance, however, would prove increasingly fragile in the following decades. In the 19th century, while the Ottoman Empire sought modernization through the Tanzimat, a silent but devastating force was gaining ground within its borders: nationalism. This ideology, inspired by the French and American revolutions and reinforced by the rise of nation-states in Europe, began to take root in the Balkan provinces, where Serbs, Greeks, Bulgarians, Albanians, Romanians, and many other communities with distinct identities lived. For these peoples, Ottoman rule, which had lasted for centuries, was no longer seen as a natural order, but as a foreign occupation that needed to be overthrown. The first major shock came with the Greek Revolution of 1821, which became a symbol for the entire region. After years of bloody fighting, and with the support of European powers, especially England, France, and Russia, Greece achieved independence in 1830. This event had an enormous psychological impact. If the Greeks, after 4 centuries of Ottoman rule, could regain their autonomy, why not the Serbs, Bulgarians, or Romanians? Greek independence became the spark for a series of similar movements. In Serbia, uprisings that had begun in the early 19th century secured relative autonomy, which was consolidated by the middle of the century. In Romania, the unification of the principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia in 1859 dealt another blow to Ottoman presence. Bulgaria, for decades, endured continuous struggles that culminated in revolts such as the April Uprising of 1876, marked by the brutal repression of the Ottoman army and the massacre of thousands of civilians, a fact that provoked international outrage and paved the way for Russian intervention. The interference of the great powers was decisive in accelerating the process. Russia, England, France, and Austria-Hungary had different interests in the Balkans, but all saw advantages in weakening the Ottoman Empire. Russia, in particular, presented itself as the protector of Slavic and Orthodox peoples, encouraging revolts against Turkish rule. The Russo-Turkish wars of the 19th century were, for the most part, justified by the idea of liberating Slavic brothers from Ottoman domination. This combination of internal and external pressures culminated in a sequence of significant territorial losses. The Treaty of Berlin of 1878 completely redrew the map of the Balkans. Serbia, Montenegro, and Romania obtained formal independence. Bulgaria achieved autonomy under Russian supervision, and Bosnia-Herzegovina was placed under the administration of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, even though it nominally remained part of Ottoman territory. For the Turks, this was an unprecedented humiliation, as much of their European possessions disappeared within just a few years. Beyond the territorial losses, the psychological impact was devastating. The Ottomans had considered the Balkans an integral part of the heart of their empire since the 14th century, and losing these lands meant losing their imperial identity itself. Constantinople, once the center of a domain stretching from Hungary to Egypt, now seemed surrounded by enemies and restricted to an ever-shrinking territory. The Balkan rebellions also revealed the limits of the Tanzimat reforms. Although it proclaimed equality among subjects, the empire failed to secure the loyalty of its Christian populations. On the contrary, the promise of equality was often interpreted as insufficient in the face of the greater aspiration, national independence. Thus, the Tanzimat proved incapable of halting the nationalist tide, which advanced with European support and was fueled by the growing historical and cultural consciousness of each people. These territorial losses were not merely a matter of borders. They forever altered the balance of the empire. By losing the Balkans, the Ottoman Empire not only reduced its geographical extent, but also lost a significant part of its economic and demographic base. The fertile agriculture of the region, the taxes from Christian communities, and the trade routes linking Central Europe to the Mediterranean represented pillars of Ottoman stability. Their absence further weakened the imperial treasury and the empire's ability to sustain a modern army. The advance of nationalism in the Balkans was therefore a double blow. It undermined the empire from within by fragmenting its social unity, and it weakened it from without by exposing it to the intervention of the great powers. It was the beginning of what many historians would call the Eastern Question, that is, the slow unraveling of the Ottoman Empire in the face of the impossibility of containing emerging nationalisms and European ambitions. The decline of Ottoman military power in the 19th century was not a sudden event, but the result of centuries of technological backwardness, mismanagement, and internal resistance to structural reforms. From the days when the Janissaries were considered one of the most feared forces in the world, the Ottoman army had transformed into a heavy, corrupt, and inefficient apparatus. The Janissary Corps, once disciplined and innovative, became synonymous with privilege, resistance to change, and corporate interests. Even after its dissolution in the auspicious incident of 1826, the empire's military forces remained incapable of fully modernizing in the face of European powers. While countries such as France, England, Austria, and Russia implemented centralized armies with advanced artillery, military railroads, and officer academies rooted in modern war sciences, the empire still struggled with archaic methods of organization, poor logistics, and outdated equipment. Industrialization, which supplied Europe with large-scale armaments, had very limited impact in Ottoman lands, as the empire failed to establish solid industrial bases. This delay meant that on the battlefield, the Ottomans almost always entered at a disadvantage. The contrast was evident in conflicts such as the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856. In that war, the Ottoman Empire managed to resist Russian pressure only thanks to the direct support of England and France, who saw the preservation of Ottoman integrity as a way to contain Russian expansion toward the Mediterranean. Although the victory temporarily preserved the empire, it became clear that without Western support, it would not have survived on its own. This external dependence was a clear sign of military and political weakness. European imperialist pressures became increasingly intense. The empire was viewed as the sick man of Europe, a decaying power that survived only because rivalries among England, France, Russia, and Austria prevented an agreement on how to divide its territories. Each power sought to secure its sphere of influence, sometimes supporting revolts, other times demanding economic and commercial privileges. Russia exploited its position as protector of Orthodox peoples in the Balkans, using faith as a justification for military intervention. Austria-Hungary advanced over Bosnia-Herzegovina and sought to expand its control in southeastern Europe. England, concerned with the safety of the route to India through the Suez Canal, aimed to keep the empire stable, while at the same time demanding economic concessions and commercial privileges. France, in turn, used its cultural and diplomatic influence to present itself as protector of Catholic communities in the Middle East, while also seeking greater presence in North Africa. These external pressures were also reflected in economic concessions known as capitulations. Treaties signed since the 16th century granted commercial privileges to European powers, but in the 19th century, these agreements became true instruments of economic submission. Foreign companies exploited resources, controlled customs, and obtained monopolies in strategic sectors, drastically reducing the empire's financial autonomy. With the treasury constantly in deficit and external debt growing, the Sublime Porte increasingly depended on Western loans, plunging into a spiral of indebtedness. Military weakness and imperialist penetration provoked within the empire a sense of humiliation and helplessness. Reformist elites attempted to implement changes inspired by the European model, but they ran into resistance from conservative sectors and the structural inability to sustain deep reforms without a solid economic base. Thus, every attempt at modernization was partial and insufficient, leaving the empire vulnerable both internally and externally. This context led to what historians call the Eastern Question, an expression used to designate the diplomatic problem surrounding the fate of the Ottoman Empire. For Europeans, the question was not if the empire would collapse, but when and who would inherit its lands. For the Ottomans, the struggle increasingly became one of survival in the face of external enemies and internal tensions, in a scenario where each military defeat and each economic concession eroded a little more of the prestige of a power that, centuries earlier, had challenged Vienna and threatened all of Central Europe. The decline of Ottoman military power and the advance of imperialist pressures, therefore, were not only symptoms of weakness, but factors that accelerated the dismantling of the empire. Without a modern army, without a robust industry, and with finances increasingly controlled by foreign creditors, all that remained for the empire was to try to survive in a precarious balance, sustained by fragile alliances and incomplete reforms, while its borders shrank before the advance of nationalism and European powers. Despite military weakness and growing external pressure, the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century experienced a cultural and architectural renaissance that reflected both the pursuit of modernization and the attempt to reaffirm its identity in the face of European expansion. This flourishing manifested itself in different areas, from the visual arts to monumental architecture, including literature and urban life. It was a way of showing the world that, although fragile in political and military terms, the empire was still capable of producing beauty, sophistication, and cultural innovation. Architecture was perhaps the most visible field of this renewal. Inspired both by Islamic tradition and by European styles, Ottoman architects created buildings that combined classical elements, such as domes and minarets, with influences from Neo-Baroque, Neo-Gothic, and even Neo-Renaissance architecture. Palaces such as Dolmabahce, built in the mid-19th century, became symbols of this new period. Unlike the austerity of earlier Ottoman palaces, Dolmabahce was designed with ostentation and luxury, featuring vast halls, crystal chandeliers, imported marble, and refined European decoration. It was a clear reflection of the Sultan's attempt to align himself with Western standards while reinforcing imperial authority. In addition to Dolmabahce, other palaces and administrative buildings arose during this period, transforming the urban landscape. The Turan Palace and the Beylik Palace are also examples of how the imperial elite sought to display modernity and sophistication without completely abandoning Ottoman traditional symbols. These spaces served not only as residences and centers of power, but also as visual representations of the empire's effort to engage with Europe while maintaining its cultural uniqueness. In the cities, public architecture was also influenced by this flourishing. Schools, courts, libraries, and hospitals began to be built following mixed styles, reflecting both the pragmatism of the Tanzimat reforms and the direct influence of foreign engineers and architects hired by the Sublime Porte. This fusion of styles eventually created a unique architectural identity that still distinguishes late Ottoman buildings today. In literature and the arts, the period witnessed the emergence of new genres and the strengthening of the press. With the introduction of modern printing and the increase in the circulation of newspapers and magazines, Ottoman intellectuals began debating ideas of nationalism, reform, and modernization. Poets and novelists explored social, political, and romantic themes, blending Arab, Persian, and Turkish literary traditions with European narrative forms. Literary works from this period are fundamental to understanding the intellectual climate of the empire in its final phase. Music and the visual arts also reflected this cultural fusion. The tradition of Ottoman music, marked by classical instruments and the modal system of makam, began to interact with Western music, Military orchestras and bands were reorganized according to European models, introducing new sounds into official ceremonies. In the visual arts, painters and craftsmen explored both traditional Islamic themes such as calligraphy and geometric motifs, and Western techniques such as oil painting and perspective. This cultural flourishing was closely linked to the political and social reform movement of the Tanzimat period, which began in 1839. By seeking to modernize administration, education, and the economy, the empire also stimulated cultural change. The creation of new schools and art academies trained a generation of intellectuals and artists who would be decisive for the transition to the 20th century. Many of them defended the idea of a renewed empire capable of balancing tradition and modernity. At the same time, there was a political dimension to this flourishing. Monumental architectural works and cultural production were used as instruments of propaganda, demonstrating to both the Ottoman people and the European powers that the empire still retained vitality and greatness. Every palace built, every newspaper founded, and every artwork displayed served as a form of symbolic resistance against the label of the sick man of Europe. Therefore, the cultural and architectural flourishing of the late period should not be seen merely as an adornment amid decline, but as an active response by the empire to the transformations of the 19th century. It was a conscious effort to affirm identity, absorb external influences, and project an image of strength and sophistication, even when political and military structures were already showing irreversible signs of wear. This cultural legacy remains visible today in palaces, mosques, literary works, and music that testify to the complexity and richness of a civilization in its final centuries of existence. At the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, the Ottoman Empire was already pejoratively referred to as the sick man of Europe. Internal corruption, inefficient bureaucracy, and military defeats had eroded central authority, while European powers constantly pressured for territorial concessions and commercial privileges. In this context, a political and intellectual movement emerged that would become known as the Young Turks, responsible for shaking the foundations of absolute monarchy and initiating a new phase of political convulsions. The Young Turks were composed mainly of students, military officers, and intellectuals who had contact with liberal and nationalist ideas in Europe. Many of them studied in Paris, Geneva, and London, where they encountered Enlightenment thought, liberalism, and revolutionary ideals. Upon returning to the empire, they brought with them the conviction that only a radical transformation could save the Ottoman state from complete disintegration. The movement advocated limiting the absolute power of the Sultan, creating a constitution, and strengthening parliamentary institutions. Sultan Abdul Hamid II, who reigned from 1876 to 1909, had initially accepted a constitution in the early years of his rule, but soon suspended it, governing in an authoritarian manner. This gesture reinforced the opposition, turning him into a target of the Young Turks. Throughout his reign, Abdul Hamid II sought to reinforce central power through censorship, secret police, and constant surveillance over the population. However, his attempt to maintain the empire's cohesion based on pan-Islamism was not enough to contain growing dissatisfaction. The Young Turks' revolt gained strength in 1908, when a military insurrection in Macedonia forced the Sultan to restore the constitution and allow elections for parliament. This was a milestone, as for the first time in decades, the empire seemed to be moving toward a modern political life, with parties and parliamentary debates. This 1908 revolution, as it became known, symbolized the definitive entry of nationalist and liberal ideas into the Ottoman political scene. The Committee of Union and Progress, the political arm of the Young Turks, assumed a central role in political life after the revolution. However, the movement was far from homogeneous. Within it coexisted liberals who defended greater autonomy for the different ethnic groups of the empire, and Turkish nationalists who sought to centralize power around Turkish identity. This internal tension would generate many conflicts in the following years, especially in regions inhabited by Arabs, Armenians, Greeks, and other peoples who did not accept a single identity. In 1909, after a counter-revolt in Istanbul organized by conservative and religious sectors who demanded the return of absolute rule, the Young Turks reacted firmly. They deposed Abdul Hamid II, replacing him with his brother, Mehmed V, who agreed to rule as a constitutional monarch. This episode marked the definitive fall of the absolute power of the sultans and the rise of a government increasingly controlled by the military and the Committee of Union and Progress. The crisis of absolute monarchy had profound impacts on the structure of the empire. On one hand, it brought the promise of political modernization, freedom of the press, and greater participation of the population in public life. On the other, it paved the way for instability with factional disputes, coup attempts, and the growing militarization of politics. The expectation of a rapid regeneration of the empire soon gave way to disappointments, especially when the Young Turks government began to adopt authoritarian and centralizing measures. Internationally, the Young Turk Revolution had immediate repercussions. European powers saw instability as an opportunity to exert even more pressure on the empire. In the Balkans, nationalist movements took advantage of the moment to strengthen their claims, culminating in the Balkan Wars a few years later. Thus, the crisis of absolute monarchy not only transformed Ottoman internal politics, but also accelerated the process of territorial fragmentation. In summary, the Young Turks' revolt represented the end of one era and the beginning of another, equally turbulent one. It was a movement born from the hope of modernization, inspired by European ideals, but which ultimately plunged the empire into new conflicts, contradictions, and challenges. By overthrowing Abdulhamid II's absolutism, the Young Turks inaugurated a phase of reforms and promises, but also of nationalist and military tensions that would soon place the empire before its most dramatic crises. The Balkan Wars, fought between 1912 and 1913, were a devastating blow to the Ottoman Empire and marked the beginning of the end of its European dominion. For centuries, the Ottomans had controlled much of the Balkans, imposing their authority over diverse peoples such as Serbs, Bulgarians, Greeks, and Albanians. However, with the advance of nationalist movements and the growing internal weakness of the empire, these peoples organized themselves in search of independence and expansion. The region became a true powder keg, where ethnic rivalries and territorial ambitions mixed with Ottoman decline. The First Balkan War broke out in October 1912, when the Balkan League, formed by Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece, and Montenegro, declared war on the Ottoman Empire. Their common goal was to expel the Ottomans from Europe and divide their territories. Within weeks, the Ottoman army suffered catastrophic defeats on multiple fronts. The League's forces advanced rapidly, conquering vast regions in Macedonia, Albania, Kosovo, and Thrace. Poorly equipped and disorganized, the Ottoman troops were unable to withstand the combined pressure of their enemies. Defeat forced the empire to sign the Treaty of London in May 1913. Under the agreement, the Ottoman Empire lost almost all its European territories, retaining only a small area around Constantinople and eastern Thrace. The territorial impact was immense. Regions that had been under Ottoman rule for centuries were permanently removed from its sphere of control. For many historians, this loss represented confirmation that the empire no longer had the military capacity to compete in Europe. However, the situation did not stabilize. Bulgaria, dissatisfied with the territorial division after the First Balkan War, clashed with its former allies, igniting the Second Balkan War in June 1913. This time, Serbia, Greece, Montenegro, and even the Ottoman Empire united against the Bulgarians. The conflict was brief, but violent. Seizing the opportunity, the Ottomans managed to recover part of eastern Thrace, including Edirne, which they recaptured in July 1913. Despite this small success, the overall outcome was still one of enormous setbacks. These wars had profound consequences for the empire. First, they destroyed any illusion that the Ottoman presence in the Balkans could be restored. Peoples who had lived for centuries under Ottoman domination finally gained independence or annexed territories, drastically reducing Turkish influence in the region. Secondly, the psychological impact was devastating. Ottoman society came to regard the Balkans not as a natural part of the empire, but as a lost territory, forever associated with humiliation and defeat. Internally, the wars reinforced the militarization of politics. The Committee of Union and Progress, led by the Young Turks, interpreted the defeats as a result of administrative weakness and lack of military discipline. As a result, they concentrated efforts on strengthening the army and adopting increasingly nationalist and centralizing policies, which heightened tensions with the empire's ethnic minorities, such as Arabs and Armenians. From an international perspective, the Balkan Wars served as a prelude to the First World War. Rivalries among the Balkan states and the indirect involvement of the great powers, such as Russia and Austria-Hungary, turned the region into one of the most unstable areas in Europe. The collapse of Ottoman presence in the Balkans not only reshaped the European map, but also created fertile ground for new disputes that would soon drag the empire into an even greater conflict. In sum, the Balkan Wars were the epitaph of Ottoman presence in Europe. They represented not only an irreversible territorial loss, but also the final demonstration of the vulnerability of an empire once mighty. For the Ottomans, the outcome of these wars was the painful realization that they were increasingly cornered, reduced to a defensive position, and on the brink of a radical transformation that would come with the Great War. The entry of the Ottoman Empire into the First World War was one of the most decisive chapters of its long history, and, at the same time, the beginning of its definitive end. In 1914, when the conflict began, the empire was already weakened by successive defeats in the Balkan Wars, economic crises and internal divisions. Even so, Ottoman leaders believed that the war could represent an opportunity for recovery, especially if combined with military restructuring and the chance to reconquer lost territories. The Committee of Union and Progress, led by the triumvirate known as the Three Pashas, Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha and Cemal Pasha, was responsible for leading the empire into war. The alliance with Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire was not immediate, but it eventually became inevitable in the face of Ottoman international isolation. The Entente powers, especially Great Britain and Russia, had already shown hostility towards the empire on several occasions, mainly due to territorial disputes. Germany, on the other hand, had for years been investing in projects within the empire, such as the construction of the Berlin-Baghdad Railway, which brought the two countries closer together. The episode that sealed the alliance was the arrival of the German cruisers Goeben and Breslau in Ottoman waters, which were incorporated into the Ottoman navy. Shortly afterward, in November 1914, the Ottomans launched naval attacks on Russian ports in the Black Sea, officially entering the war on the side of the Central Powers. However, Ottoman involvement was marked by enormous difficulties and devastating military campaigns. One of the most famous episodes was the Gallipoli campaign in 1915, when British, French and colonial forces, including Australians and New Zealanders, attempted to take the Dardanelles Straits to open a supply route to Russia. Ottoman resistance, led by the young officer Mustafa Kemal, later Ataturk, surprised the world. The campaign resulted in one of the greatest defeats of the Entente, costing hundreds of thousands of lives and consolidating Mustafa Kemal as a national hero. Another crucial front was the Caucasus, where the empire faced the Russian army. The Battle of Sarikamish in the winter of 1914-1915 ended in disaster for the Ottomans. More than 60,000 soldiers died, many frozen in the mountains. This failure had dramatic consequences. At the same time, amid paranoia of internal betrayal, the Ottoman government began mass deportations and massacres against the Armenian population in one of the darkest and most tragic episodes of the empire's history. In addition, the Ottomans faced Arab rebellions in their Middle Eastern provinces. Encouraged by Great Britain and figures such as T.E. Lawrence, the Lawrence of Arabia, the Arabs revolted against Ottoman rule, seeking to create independent states. This insurrection, combined with military defeats, contributed to the collapse of Ottoman presence in the region. On the Iraqi and Palestinian fronts, the empire suffered successive defeats against the British. The fall of Baghdad in 1917 and the conquest of Jerusalem in the same year marked irreparable strategic and symbolic losses. By the end of the war, the Ottoman armies were exhausted, the economy was destroyed, and the population was deeply worn down by hunger, disease, and human losses. The Armistice of Mudros, signed in October 1918, decreed the end of Ottoman participation in the war. Shortly afterward, Constantinople was occupied by Allied forces, and the empire entered an inevitable process of dissolution. In retrospect, the First World War was, for the Ottomans, a desperate struggle for survival, but it ultimately precipitated their downfall. Thus, Ottoman involvement in the conflict not only redefined the map of the Middle East, but also sealed the fate of an empire that, for centuries, had been one of the pillars of world politics. Its end was near, and from the ashes of the empire a new nation would be born, modern Turkey. The final collapse of the Ottoman Empire was a direct consequence of the First World War and the weight of accumulated defeats. After the signing of the Armistice of Mudros in October 1918, the Allied powers occupied strategic points of Ottoman territory, including Constantinople, the Straits of the Dardanelles and the Bosporus, as well as several provinces in the Middle East. The once vast empire was in shambles, and its leaders no longer had the power to resist external impositions. Within the empire, discontent was deep. The population suffered from hunger, epidemics and mourning for human losses, while the military was demoralized. The leadership of the three pashas had fled the country, leaving a political vacuum. In this scenario, the Allies moved forward with plans to partition Ottoman territory, driven by colonial and strategic interests. The Middle East, in particular, became a central piece, since control over its routes and resources could shift the balance of world power. In 1920, the Treaty of Sèvres was signed, a document that formalized the fragmentation of the empire. It provided for independence or international tutelage over vast regions that had once been part of Ottoman rule. Syria and Lebanon came under French mandate, while Palestine, Transjordan and Iraq came under British mandate. Greece received territories in western Anatolia and temporary control of Smyrna, and the Straits were internationalized, depriving the Ottomans of one of the most strategic points of their geography. The treaty also foresaw the creation of an independent Armenia and the possibility of a Kurdish state, although these provisions were not fully realized. The central core of the empire, Anatolia, remained weakened and at risk of losing even its sovereignty. For many Turks, the Treaty of Sèvres was seen as an unprecedented national humiliation, the symbol of absolute defeat and submission to European powers. The Ottoman monarchy, represented by Sultan Mehmed VI, accepted the treaty in an attempt to preserve what remained of authority, but a significant portion of the population and military elites did not accept it. At that moment, Mustafa Kemal, who had already distinguished himself at Gallipoli, emerged. He began to lead the nationalist movement that rejected the treaty's impositions, denouncing it as illegitimate and a betrayal of Turkish interests. This movement would give rise to the Turkish War of Independence, which would be the next step in the process of transforming the empire into a modern republic. Therefore, the Treaty of Sèvres was not just a diplomatic document, but the landmark of a historical rupture. It sealed the official end of Ottoman imperial unity, transferring its territories to foreign hands and unleashing a deep sense of revolt among the Turks. If, on the one hand, it meant the downfall of centuries of Ottoman rule over vast regions, on the other hand, it opened the way for the construction of a new national identity that would change the destiny of the region. The Ottoman defeat and the Treaty of Sèvres sparked a wave of national outrage. Many Turks considered submission to foreign powers unacceptable and saw Sultan Mehmed VI as weak and complicit. It was in this context that the leadership of Vakin Mustafa Kemal emerged, a respected officer who had gained fame for organizing the defense of Gallipoli in 1915. A staunch patriot, Kemal believed that only an organized resistance could prevent the total disappearance of the Turkish homeland. In 1919, he began a journey toward Anatolia, where he would start organizing the national liberation movement. From the city of Samsun, Kemal coordinated conferences with local leaders, seeking to mobilize the population against foreign occupation and the submissive government of the Sultan. In Erzurum and Sivas, congresses were held to define the principles of the nationalist movement: rejection of the Treaty of Sèvres, defense of Anatolia's territorial integrity, and the proclamation of the Turkish people's sovereignty over their destiny. While Constantinople remained under occupation, a new power structure was forming in Anatolia. Kemal and his allies established a parallel parliament in Ankara, which would become the political and military center of the resistance. From there, they organized armed forces loyal to the nationalist cause, which soon clashed with Greek, Armenian, French, and even British troops in some areas. The conflict became known as the Turkish War of Independence, fought between 1919 and 1923. The fiercest battles were against Greece, which had been authorized by the Allies to occupy Smyrna and expand its presence in western Anatolia. Greek troops advanced rapidly, but were contained and defeated by Kemal's army in campaigns that became symbols of resistance. Among them were the Battle of Sacarias in 1921 and the Great Offensive of 1922, which culminated in the recapture of Smyrna and the collapse of the Greek presence. The Kemalist movement was not only military, it also sought to build political and social legitimacy. Kemal promoted the idea that the new state should be based on popular sovereignty, rather than the absolute authority of a sultan. This discourse gained strength as the nationalists achieved victories, attracting the support of intellectuals, soldiers, and civilians discontent with foreign occupation. The success of the movement culminated in the signing of the San Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, which replaced the Treaty of Sèvres. Unlike the first, Lausanne recognized Turkey's sovereignty over Anatolia and eastern Thrace, granting the new country a solid territorial foundation. This triumph sealed the victory of the Turkish War of Independence and paved the way for the proclamation of the Republic, with Mustafa Kemal as its supreme leader. Thus, the War of Independence was not merely a military conflict, but the transitional process between a defeated empire and a modern nation. It represented the definitive break with the Ottoman order and the birth of Turkey as a nation-state, marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. With the victory in the Turkish War of Independence and the signing of the Treaty of Lausanne, the new political order began to consolidate. The Ottoman Empire, which for centuries had dominated territories across 3 continents, came to an official end. In November 1922, the Sultanate was abolished, and Mehmet VI left Constantinople, departing into exile. This decision symbolized the definitive break with the old imperial order and opened the way for a profound political transformation. The year 1923 would prove decisive. On October 29th, the Republic of Turkey was officially proclaimed, with Ankara as its capital. This change was not merely administrative, but carried deep political meaning. Constantinople, despite its grandeur and historical prestige, was associated with the empire and with submission to foreign powers. Ankara, located in the heart of Anatolia, represented the new nationalist spirit, far from external influences and closer to the population that had sustained the resistance. The undisputed leader of this process was Mustafa Kemal, who would adopt the title Ataturk, or Father of the Turks. He was elected the first president of the Republic and immediately launched a program of reforms to modernize and consolidate the new state. His goals included centralizing power, building a secular government, and creating institutions capable of leading the country toward modernity. The foundation of the Republic also brought profound institutional changes. The Ankara Parliament became the supreme authority, permanently replacing the old Ottoman system based on hereditary rule. Legitimacy was now rooted in popular sovereignty, no longer in the figure of a sultan or caliph. Although democracy was still incipient and tightly controlled, the idea that power emanated from the Turkish people gained strength as a founding principle. The transition was not without challenges. Many segments of society remained attached to imperial traditions, especially the religious authority of the caliphate, which had not yet been abolished at that moment. However, Ataturk and his allies were determined to consolidate the new regime. The creation of the Republic was therefore not merely a legal act, but a revolutionary movement that redefined Turkish identity, shifting it from a multi-ethnic empire to a unified nation-state. With the proclamation of 1923, the world witnessed the birth of a new regional power. Turkey emerged as the heir to a grand imperial past, but also as the protagonist of a project of modernization and national independence. The foundation of the Republic was the starting point for an intense cycle of reforms that would radically change the political, social, and cultural life of the Turkish people. With the proclamation of the Republic in 1923, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk began one of the most profound transformations in the history of the Middle East. The objective was clear: to break definitively with the heritage of the Ottoman Empire and place the new Turkey on a path of modernization, secularization, and alignment with the Western model. This process became known as the Kemalist reforms, which encompassed virtually every aspect of political, social, and cultural life. One of the first measures was the abolition of the Caliphate in 1924. bringing an end to an institution that for centuries had symbolized the religious unity of the Islamic world. The decision was bold and controversial, but it reflected Ataturk's vision that the state should be secular, free from religious control. In the same movement, traditional religious schools, madrasas, and Sharia-based courts were shut down, replaced by a modern legal system inspired by European models, such as the Swiss Civil Code. In education, the changes were equally radical. Teaching became centralized and controlled by the state, removing religious influence. New universities, libraries, and secular schools were created with the intention of preparing citizens for modernity. Furthermore, in 1928, Ataturk promoted the Hadalphabet reform, replacing the Arabic Ottoman script with the Un-Latin alphabet, a change that revolutionized communication, made literacy easier, and brought the country closer to Western cultural practices. The reforms also extended to the social and cultural sphere. The use of the yish fez eye, the traditional Ottoman headgear, was banned in 1925 in favor of Western-style hats, a symbolic gesture of breaking with the past. Similarly, the abandonment of the veil and traditional clothing, especially among women, was encouraged. Ataturk promoted laws granting women unprecedented political rights in the Islamic world, including the right to vote and to run for office as early as the 1930s, placing Turkey ahead of many European countries. In the economic field, the goal was industrialization and state-led development, with investments in factories, railroads, and basic infrastructure. The objective was to strengthen the domestic economy and reduce dependence on foreign capital. In politics, Ataturk consolidated a single-party regime under the Republican People's Party, ensuring stability but also limiting democratic pluralism. These reforms provoked resistance from conservative sectors who saw the changes as a threat to Islamic and cultural traditions. Religious uprisings, such as the Sheikh Said Rebellion in 1925, were harshly suppressed. Even so, Ataturk did not retreat. For him, modernizing Turkey was a historic and irreversible mission. The impact of the Kemalist reforms was deep and lasting. They redefined Turkish identity, creating a secular, nationalist, and modern state that sought alignment with the West without abandoning its cultural uniqueness. To this day, many of Turkey's social and political tensions have their roots in this period, between those who defend Ataturk's secular legacy and those who desire a return to more traditional values. After the death of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk in 1938, Turkey entered a new phase marked by the effort to preserve and adapt his reforms throughout the turbulent 20th century. The Kemalist legacy was not only political, but also cultural and identitarian, shaping the way the country saw itself and how it was perceived by the world. This legacy revolved around 6 fundamental principles known as the 6 arrows: republicanism, nationalism, populism, statism, reformism, and secularism. Each of them served as a pillar of the Republic and was constantly reinterpreted throughout the decades. During the Second World War, Turkey, under the leadership of İsmet İnönü, adopted a cautious policy of neutrality. Although it maintained contacts with both blocs, it only formally entered the war in 1945, near its end, in order to align with the victors and secure a place in the newly created United Nations. This stance highlighted the pragmatism of Turkish foreign policy, which sought to protect its sovereignty and avoid invasions. In the post-war years, Turkey quickly moved closer to the United States and Western Europe. With the rise of the Cold War, the country became strategically important due to its geographical position at the crossroads between Europe and the Middle East. In 1952, it joined the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, becoming one of the West's main allies against Soviet expansion. This military and political integration consolidated Turkey's role as a bridge between different worlds, but also brought new challenges, such as the need to reconcile internal modernization with external pressures. On the domestic political front, the decades from the 1950s to the 1980s were marked by instability. Military coups in 1960, 1971, and 1980 demonstrated the weight of the armed forces as guardians of Kemalism and national order. Each intervention reflected the tension between different visions of society. On one side, those who defended the continuation of Ataturk's secular and centralized reforms. On the other, conservative or religious groups who sought to reverse or soften the secular nature of the state. The Turkish economy also experienced highs and lows. The industrialization project initiated by Ataturk faced financial crises, but was complemented by liberal reforms at different times, especially in the 1980s under the leadership of Turgut Özal, who promoted greater openness to foreign trade. This process marked Turkey's definitive entry into a globalized economy, although with strong internal inequalities between urban and rural regions. In the cultural and social sphere, Ataturk's legacy remained deeply present. His image became omnipresent, with portraits, monuments, and speeches evoking his vision of a modern Turkey. The cult of his memory transformed him almost into a national myth, a father of the Turks, whose symbolic authority still influences political debates today. At the same time, this cult created dilemmas. To what extent should Turkey remain faithful to its rigid secular heritage, and to what extent could it make room for popular religiosity, deeply rooted in society? This internal conflict was one of the most striking traits of 20th century Turkey, the balance between tradition and modernity. While part of the population identified with Western values and sought European integration, another part defended the appreciation of Islamic roots and Ottoman culture. This tension generated intense debates that are still reflected today in the country's politics and daily life. Thus, Ataturk's legacy crossed the 20th century as a set of principles in constant dispute, which gave shape to the modern Turkish state, but also left open challenges that would remain alive in the 21st century. Throughout the 21st century, Turkey consolidated itself as a regional power of strategic importance, balancing its position between Europe, the Middle East, Central Asia, and the Mediterranean. This geopolitical role is a direct result of its privileged location, controlling the Bosporus Strait and functioning as a bridge between worlds. Modern Turkey carries the marks of the Kemalist legacy, but also underwent profound transformations, with new leaders, parties, and internal challenges that redefined its trajectory. One of the central points of this era was the process of attempting integration into the European Union. Since signing the association agreement in 1963, Turkey had dreamed of becoming a full member of the European bloc. In the following decades, several political, economic, and legal reforms were implemented to meet the Copenhagen criteria, which demanded democratic stability, respect for human rights, and a market economy. In 1999, the country was officially recognized as a candidate for membership, and in 2005, the accession negotiations began. However, political tensions, civil rights issues, the role of the military, the Kurdish question, and debates over religious freedom complicated the process. To this day, Turkey's accession remains suspended, representing both the country's ambition and its frustrations in its relationship with Europe. At the same time, Turkey reinforced its presence in the Middle East and the Islamic world. During the governments of Recep Tayyip Erdogan and the Justice and Development Party, AKP, foreign policy took on a more active and independent character, seeking balance between the West and its Muslim neighbors. This stance, often called Neo-Ottomanism, reflected the desire to recover the cultural and political influence that the former empire had exercised over the region. Turkey became more directly involved in regional conflicts, such as in Syria, Iraq, and Libya, positioning itself as a key actor in the Eastern Mediterranean. On the domestic front, Turkish society faced growing divisions between defenders of strict secularism and those who sought greater space for religion in public life. Erdogan's reforms increased the visibility of Islam, allowing the wearing of the veil in public spaces and promoting policies that strengthened the role of Islamic identity. This generated clashes with more secular sectors of society, especially in major cities such as Istanbul and Ankara, where the Kemalist heritage is still strongly defended. The Kurdish issue also intensified. The Muttiyada Kurdistan Workers' Party, PKK, considered a terrorist organization by the government, continued armed actions in pursuit of autonomy or independence for Turkey's Kurds. The prolonged conflict brought instability and repercussions in the country's domestic and international politics, requiring complex negotiations that did not always progress. In the economic field, Turkey experienced periods of significant growth, becoming one of the world's leading emerging economies. Large infrastructure projects, such as airports, bridges, and pipelines, transformed the urban landscape and consolidated the country as a logistical and energy hub between Europe and Asia. However, economic crises, inflation, and depreciation of the lira also marked moments of fragility. Another point of prominence is Turkey's role in the refugee issue. During the Syrian civil war, millions of people sought refuge in Turkish territory, making the country the world's largest host of refugees. This situation brought both international recognition and internal social tensions, with impacts on politics and the economy. Thus, contemporary Turkey lives in constant balance, part oriented towards Europe and its values of integration, part rooted in the Middle East and Islam, and another part connected to its own national traditions and Ottoman heritage. This mosaic of identities and challenges defines the country as a unique actor, one that simultaneously seeks modernity while preserving its historical traits. Contemporary Turkish identity is a mosaic of influences that span centuries of transformations, bringing together elements inherited from the Ottoman Empire, the reforms of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, and the tensions between tradition and modernity. Turkish society constantly faces the challenge of balancing its imperial past, its Islamic heritage, and its pursuit of integration with the West. This balance shapes not only politics, but also daily life, culture, and the way Turks perceive themselves in the world. Modern Turkish culture is marked by diversity. Music, for example, ranges from the traditional sounds of instruments such as the saz and the ney, present in folk songs and Sufi rituals, to contemporary pop that dominates radios and digital platforms. Turkish cinema, which has established itself as one of the most influential industries in the Middle East, portrays both family dramas in villages and grand historical productions that revisit the feats of the Ottoman Empire, often with a patriotic tone. These cultural productions not only entertain, but also help reaffirm Turkish identity in a globalized world. Turkish literature also holds a prominent place, with figures such as Orhan Pamuk, Nobel Prize winner, who brought international visibility by exploring themes of memory, identity, and cultural conflict between East and West. Alongside him, numerous writers continue to express the complexities of contemporary Turkish society, where the dilemmas of faith, modernity, politics, and family intertwine in rich and profound narratives. In social life, the contrast between Kemalist secularism and religious resurgence is evident. While in modern neighborhoods of Istanbul or Ankara cafes, universities, nightlife, and westernized lifestyles predominate, in other regions, Islamic tradition dictates the rhythm of daily life. The presence of mosques, the practice of prayer, and the wearing of the Muslim veil are visible expressions of this religious identity that remains very strong, especially in the countryside. This contrast, far from being just a division, constitutes one of the forces that shape the dynamism of modern Turkey. Another essential aspect is Turkish gastronomy, which represents the fusion of centuries of cultural exchange. Kebab, baklava, Turkish coffee and tea are symbols of hospitality and social life in the country, present both in humble homes and in large restaurants. This gastronomic tradition reinforces the feeling of identity and continuity, keeping practices alive that date back to the Ottoman period. In education, Turkey has invested heavily in universities and research centers, while debates about religious influence and school curricula show how education has also become a space of identity dispute. Turkish youth, connected to the digital world, consume and produce global content, but also reframe tradition within new languages and technologies. Festivities and religious practices, such as Ramadan, coexist with secular events such as Republic Day created by Atatürk. This coexistence of celebrations reinforces the idea that Turkey is not only the heir of a glorious past, but also the builder of a multifaceted present, where religion, politics, and modernity coexist in both tension and harmony. Thus, contemporary Turkish identity cannot be understood as homogeneous, but as a living organism in constant transformation, which dialogues with the Ottoman past, with the reforms of the 20th century, and with the challenges of the 21st century. This cultural richness, combined with its strategic position, guarantees Turkey a unique role on the global stage. Turkey's geographical position makes it one of the most strategic countries in the contemporary world. Located at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, With access to the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, and close to the Middle East, Turkey stands at a vital junction for trade, energy, and international politics. This geographical factor, which was already decisive during the height of the Ottoman Empire, continues to directly influence the country's role in global relations, consolidating it both as a bridge between distinct worlds and as a point of tension. Turkey has been a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, since 1952, playing a fundamental role as the Western military alliance's front line in the region. Its strategic position, close to Russia and the Middle East, makes Turkish air bases and ports central elements for military operations and conflict monitoring. However, this condition requires skillful diplomacy, as Turkey also maintains complex relations with Russia, especially in the energy sector and regional disputes. In the European sphere, Turkey has for decades sought a closer relationship with the European Union, having begun accession negotiations in 2005, yet issues related to human rights, democracy, freedom of the press, and migration policies have stalled the process. Even without being a full member of the European Union, Turkey remains an indispensable partner for the continent, especially in controlling migration flows from the Middle East, something that became even more relevant after the refugee crisis of 2015. In the Middle East, Turkey's actions are marked by an assertive foreign policy. The country seeks to establish itself as a regional leader, playing roles in conflicts such as the Syrian civil war, the Kurdish question, and the struggle for influence against countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia. Turkey's military presence in neighboring territories and its support for certain armed groups show that it uses both diplomatic and military power to defend its strategic interests. Another central point is Turkey's role in the energy sector. As a transit territory for oil and gas pipelines linking the Caucasus and the Middle East to Europe, the country has become a fundamental hub in global energy security. This role gives Turkey a significant geopolitical advantage, allowing it to negotiate deals and exert pressure during times of crisis. Turkey's foreign policy also reveals greater ambitions to consolidate itself not only as a bridge between East and West, but also as an independent power capable of influencing multiple scenarios. This ambition became evident in its relations with emerging powers such as China, especially within the Belt and Road Initiative, which sees Turkey as an important link connecting Asia to Europe. At the same time, Turkey faces internal challenges that affect its geopolitics. Political tensions, social polarization, and issues related to minorities such as the Kurds have a direct impact on its international image. Even so, the country maintains its position as a central actor in almost every global geopolitical discussion, whether in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Middle East, the Black Sea, or international forums. Thus, in the 21st century, Turkey occupies an ambiguous yet powerful role: NATO ally, Russian partner, frustrated European Union candidate, and aspiring leader in the Middle East. This ability to navigate between different blocs, though often seen as contradictory, is precisely what ensures the country's relevance and autonomy in the international arena. The legacy of the Ottoman Empire remains alive in many ways, shaping borders, cultures, religions, and identities to this very day. The vastness of the empire, which stretched across 3 continents, left deep marks on territories that, even after centuries of independence or annexation, continue to carry Ottoman elements in their architecture, cuisine, language, and traditions. The empire's heritage is not only found in monuments and historical records, but also in the way it defines social and cultural patterns that withstand the passage of time. In architecture, the Ottoman Empire created a unique fusion of Islamic, Byzantine, and Persian elements, resulting in iconic constructions such as the Blue Mosque in Istanbul and the palace complexes of Topkapi and Dolmabahce. The Ottoman style influenced mosques, schools, public baths, and markets throughout the region, establishing an aesthetic that became a hallmark in Middle Eastern and Balkan countries. This architectural legacy still attracts millions of visitors every year and continues to inspire modern constructions in Muslim nations. Culturally, Ottoman music, poetry, and cuisine remain alive. Gastronomy, for instance, spread across the Mediterranean and the Balkans, leaving behind dishes such as kebabs, baklava, and Turkish coffee, which is still a symbol of hospitality in many countries. The Ottoman literary tradition, written in Arabic, Persian, and Turkish, also served as a cultural bridge connecting societies of different languages, consolidating a link between East and West. Another central aspect of the Ottoman legacy is the ethnic and religious question. The millet system, which granted a degree of autonomy to religious communities, left its mark on how modern societies manage minorities. The forced coexistence for centuries of Muslims, Christians, and Jews under Ottoman rule influenced both notions of tolerance and rivalries, dynamics still visible in today's conflicts and alliances across the region. The Ottoman Empire also shaped borders that remain sources of contemporary political tensions. The dissolution of the empire after World War I and the agreements that redrew the Middle East created artificial dividing lines that still fuel disputes, such as the Kurdish issue, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the fragmentation of Syria and Iraq. The modern map of the region is to a great extent a consequence of the empire's fall. The Turkish language, although significantly reformed after Ataturk's republic, still preserves vocabulary and expressions inherited from the Ottoman period, just as Balkan and Middle Eastern languages carry words of Turkish origin. This linguistic exchange is further proof of how deeply the empire influenced collective identities. In the legal and administrative fields, the centralized and bureaucratic Ottoman system established practices that inspired modern states across the region. The use of detailed records of land, taxes, and population became a governance model absorbed and adapted by countries that emerged after the empire's collapse. Finally, the Ottoman legacy is also symbolic. It represents the memory of a Muslim empire that rivaled Europe's great Christian powers and managed to maintain its influence for more than 6 centuries. For many, it is a source of historical pride. For others, a reminder of domination. In any case, its heritage continues to shape the present, making it impossible to understand the contemporary world without looking at the trajectory of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was one of the most enduring political formations in history, spanning from the late 13th century to the early 20th century. For more than 600 years, it was not only a military and administrative power, but also a crossroads of cultures, languages, and religions. Its longevity and territorial breadth place it among the great empires of world history, alongside Rome, Imperial China, and the British Empire. The fall of the empire did not erase its influence. On the contrary, it projected it even more strongly into the future, as the political vacuum left after its dissolution provoked profound reconfigurations. Modern states were born from its former territories, but they inherited both the marks of its organization and the conflicts that emerged from its fragmentation. Thus, every border drawn, every legal system maintained or rejected, and every cultural identity reinforced or suppressed are part of the long shadow the empire cast over the following centuries. Ottoman history also illustrates the unstable balance between tradition and innovation. It was an empire that adopted modern technologies such as gunpowder and firearms, but one that also remained bound to administrative and military structures that, over time, lost effectiveness. This duality explains both its meteoric rise and its prolonged decline. It remained powerful because it adapted, but it fell because it could not fully keep pace with the rapid transformations of modernity. The cultural legacy is equally vast. The art, architecture, and cuisine that flourished under the Ottomans still shape the daily lives of millions of people. Mosque domes, traditional markets, public baths, and oriental music are visible marks of an empire that became part of the collective identity of different peoples. Coffee, a symbol of social gathering and hospitality, was popularized worldwide through Ottoman practices. Moreover, the empire left lessons on coexistence and diversity. The millet system, although imperfect, allowed multiple religions to coexist under the same rule, something rare among many powers of the time. This experience offered lessons on tolerance, but also revealed the inevitable tensions when distinct groups live under the same authority. In concluding the trajectory of the Ottoman Empire, it becomes evident that its history is not confined to the past. It remains alive in current geopolitical disputes, in preserved cultural traditions, and in collective memories that withstand the test of time. The study of the empire is not only an exercise in looking back, but also in understanding how the present was shaped by centuries of conquests, reforms, decline, and resilience. The Ottoman Empire, therefore, is not merely a chapter of history. It is a thread that connects the medieval world to the modern, the East to the West, cultural diversity to the formation of national identities. Its shadow is long because its imprint is deep, and to understand its trajectory is to grasp an essential part of human history.